Joshua would one day lead Israel into the land it had been promised. He would cross the Jordan, confront fortified cities, and divide an inheritance among the tribes. Yet the first great danger attached to his story was not waiting behind the walls of Canaan. It was already traveling with him. Israel could be delivered from slavery, guarded through the wilderness, and brought to the foot of God's mountain, then turn against the covenant almost as soon as it was made. Before Joshua could lead this people, he had to see what could defeat them, even when no enemy army was present. His story begins, however, with an enemy that could be seen. Israel had left Egypt but had not yet reached Sinai. The journey through the wilderness of sin had exposed how vulnerable this newly freed population remained. Food had become a crisis before the manna appeared. At Rephidim, water became a crisis, and the people quarreled with Moses so sharply that he feared they might stone him. Water came from the rock, but the episode left behind the names Massa and Meribah, reminders of testing and contention. Then, while the camp was still at Rephidim, Amalek attacked. This is where Joshua enters the biblical story. Exodus does not pause to introduce his childhood or explain how he acquired military experience. Moses simply calls him and gives him an assignment: choose men from Israel and go out to fight Amalek. By this point, Israel was an immense traveling community burdened with families, livestock, possessions, and the practical disorder of migration. It had escaped Pharaoh's forces through the sea, but that rescue had not turned the former slaves into an established army. Joshua's first recorded responsibility was to select a fighting force from among them and meet an attacker in open conflict. Moses would not accompany the troops onto the field. He told Joshua that on the following day he would stand on the top of a hill with the staff of God in his hand. That staff connected this battle with the acts of deliverance Israel had already witnessed. It had been raised during the contest in Egypt and over the sea. Just before the Amalekite attack, Moses had used it when water came from the rock. But the presence of the staff did not remove the need for Joshua to choose men, organize them, and fight. The story places divine help and human responsibility together without confusing them. Joshua did what Moses commanded. He went out against Amalek while Moses climbed the hill with Aaron and Hur. From that higher ground, the action below could be observed. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. Whenever his hand lowered, Amalek gained the advantage. The course of the battle turned visibly with the raised hand, yet Moses could not maintain the posture indefinitely. His hands became heavy. Aaron and Hur placed a stone beneath him so that he could sit, then stood on either side and supported his hands until sunset. Down on the field, Joshua still had to sustain the fight. The account does not give his formations, his casualties, or a speech to his men. It does not turn the battle into a legend of personal invincibility. It says that Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and its people with the sword. The victory depended neither on Joshua acting alone nor on Moses standing alone. Joshua fought, Moses raised the staff, and Aaron and Hur held up the hands that had grown weak. Israel survived its first recorded wilderness battle through a chain of responsibilities in which no one person was presented as sufficient. What followed mattered especially for Joshua. God instructed Moses to write the event as a memorial and to recite it in Joshua's hearing, because Amalek's aggression would not be treated as a passing border clash. Its memory and its eventual judgment would extend beyond that day. Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." For Joshua, the first victory was therefore also a lesson in memory. The battle was not his private achievement. It belonged inside the larger account of what Israel's God was doing, and Joshua was specifically told to hear and carry that account forward. Nothing in the scene announces that he will succeed Moses. At Rephidim, he is the man sent into combat while Moses remains on the hill. The distinction is clear. Joshua receives commands. Moses gives them. Joshua leads selected fighters. Moses bears the staff associated with Israel's deliverance. Yet the memorial spoken into Joshua's hearing quietly gives him a future-facing responsibility. He is not only useful in the present fight, he is someone expected to remember what the next stage of Israel's life will require. The people moved on from Rephidim and reached the wilderness of Sinai. There, at the mountain, the scale of Joshua's education changed. Israel had seen power in Egypt, provision in the wilderness, and help in battle. At Sinai, the rescued population was summoned into covenant. Thunder, lightning, thick cloud, fire, smoke, and the sound of a trumpet marked the mountain as a place the people could not approach casually. Moses went between God and Israel, receiving commands and conveying them to the nation. The people heard the terms placed before them and repeatedly declared that they would obey. Exodus later describes a formal covenant ceremony. Moses built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars corresponding to the 12 tribes. Young men offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as peace offerings. Moses placed part of the blood in basins and threw part against the altar. He read the book of the covenant aloud, and the people answered that they would do everything the Lord had spoken and would obey. Moses then threw blood on the people and identified it as the blood of the covenant. Joshua is not named in that public ceremony, but he soon appears close to its central mediator. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders went up the mountain. The account says that they saw the God of Israel with something like a pavement of sapphire beneath his feet, clear as the sky itself. Yet judgment did not fall on these representatives of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. It was a covenant meal at the boundary between divine holiness and a people who had pledged themselves to obedience. Then Moses was called higher. God told him to come up and remain on the mountain so that he could receive the stone tablets with the law and commandments written for Israel's instruction. Moses rose with Joshua, who is now called his assistant. This was a different position from the battlefield at Rephidim. Joshua was not commanding men with a sword. He was accompanying Moses toward the cloud that covered Sinai. The text does not specify every point at which Joshua waited or how near he came to the summit. Moses told the elders to remain until he returned and left Aaron and Hur available to settle disputes. Moses then went into the cloud. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day God called to him from within it. To the Israelites below, the glory at the summit looked like a consuming fire. Moses remained there 40 days and 40 nights. Joshua had entered the mountain with him, but the revelations recorded there were given to Moses. They included detailed instructions for the sanctuary, the ark, the priesthood, the offerings, and the Sabbath. The covenant was taking institutional form. Israel would not simply move away from Sinai with a list of general ideals. The holy God, who had brought them out of Egypt, was establishing how he would dwell among them and how they were to live as his people. Below, the passing time produced a different response. The people saw that Moses delayed in coming down. Their demand to Aaron was blunt: make gods to go before them, because they did not know what had happened to this Moses, the man who had brought them out of Egypt. The mountain still stood above them. The cloud and fire had not been forgotten history. The covenant ceremony had taken place only recently, yet Moses' absence created a space in which uncertainty became rebellion. Aaron told them to remove the gold earrings worn by their wives, sons, and daughters. The people brought the gold to him. He fashioned it into the image of a calf, and the people identified the image as the gods who had brought Israel out of Egypt. Aaron built an altar before it and announced a festival to the Lord. The next day they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Then they sat down to eat and drink and rose to celebrate. The offense was not simply that Israel had chosen a completely unrelated religious festival. Aaron used the covenant name of Israel's God, while placing a manufactured image at the center of worship. The people attached the deliverance from Egypt to something made from their own jewelry. They had pledged obedience at an altar beneath Sinai. Now, at another altar, they reshaped their deliverer into a form they could see and manage. On the mountain, God told Moses that the people had corrupted themselves and quickly departed from the commanded way. He described them as stiff-necked and declared his intention to consume them, offering instead to make a great nation from Moses. Moses pleaded for Israel. He appealed to the meaning Egypt would assign to their destruction and to the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. The threatened destruction did not proceed, but the breach remained. Moses turned and began descending with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, tablets described as God's own work, written on both sides. Joshua was with him on the descent. After the long separation above the camp, he heard the sound rising from below and interpreted it as the noise of battle. It was a natural judgment from the man first introduced as a battlefield commander. Moses corrected him. The sound was neither the cry of victory nor the cry of defeat. It was singing. Then the camp came into view. Moses saw the calf and the dancing. The tablets in his hands were the tangible witness of the covenant Israel had just broken. He threw them down and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. Joshua, who had once fought to preserve Israel from Amalek, now stood beside Moses as Israel's own worship made the rupture visible. Moses burned the calf, ground it into powder, scattered the powder on water, and made the Israelites drink. He confronted Aaron, whose explanation shifted blame toward the people and reduced his own workmanship to an absurd account. The gold had gone into the fire and the calf had come out. Moses saw that the people had broken loose and that Aaron had allowed the disorder to expose them. He called for those loyal to the Lord, and the sons of Levi gathered to him. Judgment passed through the camp, and about 3,000 men died that day. On the following day, Moses returned to plead for the people, even asking to be blotted from God's book if their sin could not be forgiven. The answer preserved a distinction Moses could not erase. The one who sinned would bear guilt. Israel would still be commanded forward, but the breach brought punishment, plague, and a changed journey. Joshua had won his first battle by obeying Moses beneath an uplifted staff. At Sinai, he descended beside the same leader carrying tablets that Israel had already violated. The contrast would remain with him. External enemies could threaten Israel's path, but covenant unfaithfulness could shatter it from inside the camp. Before Joshua inherited authority, before he approached the Jordan, he witnessed both kinds of danger at their beginning. The changed journey began with distance. Moses took a tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the people, calling it the tent of meeting. This was not yet the completed tabernacle whose pattern had been given on Sinai. It functioned during the crisis as a place where anyone seeking the Lord could go, but its position made the consequence of Israel's betrayal impossible to miss. The God who had promised to dwell among them was now consulted beyond the camp's boundary. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, the people rose and stood at the entrances of their own tents, watching until he entered. The pillar of cloud descended and remained at the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. When the people saw the cloud, they bowed in worship, each from the opening of his dwelling. The scene held access and estrangement together. God had not abandoned Israel, but the easy assumption that his presence would travel among them could no longer be taken for granted. Moses continued pleading that the nation should not be sent forward without that presence. An angelic guide and the promise of land were not enough to erase the crisis. Moses asked how Israel could be distinguished from every other people if the Lord did not go with them. He received the assurance he sought, and he asked to see God's glory. The answer granted a protected revelation while preserving the boundary no human being could cross. Moses would be placed in a cleft of rock and covered as the divine glory passed by. Joshua's place in this episode is described in one quiet line. When Moses returned to the camp, Joshua, son of Nun, called a young man, and Moses' assistant did not leave the tent. The text does not explain what duties kept him there, and it does not place him inside the conversations reserved for Moses. It shows him remaining at the meeting place while Israel's relationship with God was being painfully restored. The warrior of Rephidim had become a constant attendant at the place where guidance was sought. The camp eventually resumed its ordered life. The covenant was renewed, the sanctuary was constructed, the priests were installed, and Israel was arranged for the march from Sinai. Months passed before the cloud lifted and the people moved into the wilderness again. The nation now possessed commandments, a priesthood, a portable sanctuary, tribal formations, and the visible sign of divine guidance. Yet organization could direct their movement without removing the habits that had already surfaced. Complaining broke out after the journey began. The text does not preserve the first complaint's specific grievance. It says that the Lord heard the people speaking against their hardships, and fire burned among them, consuming at the outskirts of the camp. They cried to Moses. Moses prayed. The fire subsided. The place was called Taberah, burning, because the fire had burned among them. The warning was immediate, but it did not settle the deeper dissatisfaction. A mixed group within the camp developed an intense craving, and the Israelites joined in. They asked who would give them meat. Their recollection of Egypt became a list of foods: fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Slavery disappeared from the memory they chose to voice. What remained was a picture of varied meals supposedly available without cost. In front of them lay manna, the daily provision that had sustained the camp. But familiarity had turned provision into an object of contempt. Numbers describes manna as resembling coriander seed, with an appearance like resin. The people gathered it, ground or crushed it, cooked it in pots, and made cakes from it. Its taste is compared to something prepared with oil. It arrived with the dew at night. Nothing in the account suggests that the food had stopped nourishing them. The crisis concerned desire. They had begun measuring freedom by what they missed from Egypt, and families stood weeping at the entrances of their tents. Moses heard the widespread crying and brought his own complaint before God. He asked why the burden of the entire people had been placed upon him. He had not conceived or given birth to this nation, yet he was expected to carry it as a nurse carries an infant toward the land promised to its ancestors. He could not provide meat for such a multitude. The responsibility had become too heavy to bear alone, and he spoke with the desperation of a leader asking to die rather than continue under it. The answer addressed both burdens. Moses was told to gather 70 elders of Israel, men already known as elders and officers of the people, and bring them to the tent of meeting. God would take some of the spirit resting on Moses and place it upon them so that they could share the load. The people, meanwhile, were to consecrate themselves. They would receive meat not for 1 or 2 days, or even 20, but for an entire month, until it became loathsome to them. Their craving had carried an accusation. Life in Egypt had been preferable to the journey under God's care. Moses questioned how meat could be supplied to 600,000 men on foot, even if flocks and herds were slaughtered or all the fish of the sea gathered. The reply was a challenge to his calculation. Was the Lord's power limited? Moses then assembled the 70 around the tent. The cloud descended, and the Spirit rested upon the elders. They prophesied when the Spirit came upon them, visibly confirming that the burden of leadership was no longer to rest on Moses in the same way. 2 of the registered elders, Eldad and Medad, had remained in the camp instead of going out to the tent. Even there, the Spirit rested upon them, and they prophesied among the tents. A young man ran from the camp and reported it to Moses. Joshua responded immediately, "My lord Moses, stop them." It was the instinct of a fiercely loyal assistant. Joshua had remained near Moses through battle, mountain, rebellion, and the separated tent. Now authority appeared to be operating beyond the location and arrangement Moses had established. Joshua treated it as something that might need restraint. Moses did not rebuke Eldad and Medad. He questioned Joshua instead. Was Joshua jealous on his behalf? Moses wished that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would place his spirit upon them. The correction expanded Joshua's understanding of leadership. Loyalty to Moses could not mean protecting Moses' status from every person whom God empowered. Moses had asked for help because exclusive responsibility was crushing him. The appearance of the Spirit on Eldad and Medad was not a threat to his leadership, but evidence that divine action was not confined by Joshua's expectation of where authorized service should occur. The elders and Moses returned to the camp, and the dispute ended without Eldad and Medad being silenced. The craving, however, reached its own consequence. A wind drove quail in from the sea and brought them down around the camp over a vast area. The birds were accessible in extraordinary numbers, and the people gathered them throughout the day, the night, and the following day. Even the person who gathered least collected an enormous quantity. They spread the birds around the camp, preparing the abundance they had demanded. Before the meat could be fully consumed, while it was still between their teeth, a severe plague struck. The place was named Kibroth Hattaavah, Graves of Craving, because those who had yielded themselves to the craving were buried there. What had been requested as relief became the mark of another wilderness graveyard. Israel then moved on toward Hazeroth, and from there into the wilderness of Paran. Paran brought Joshua to a new responsibility. God instructed Moses to send men to explore Canaan, one leader from each ancestral tribe. This was not a loosely gathered band of scouts. The chosen men represented the whole nation, and their observations would carry public weight. Their task was to examine the land Israel was approaching so that the people could understand the country in which the promise was to take physical form. Joshua represented the tribe of Ephraim. In the list of the 12, he is first named Hoshea, son of Nun. The passage then notes that Moses called Hoshea Joshua. Exodus has already used the name Joshua throughout the earlier narrative, so Numbers does not require us to imagine a renaming ceremony at this precise moment. It preserves the connection between the names as part of his identification. Hoshea carries the sense of salvation. Joshua identifies the Lord as the one who saves. The man who had learned that victory did not come from his sword alone now carried that name into Canaan. Caleb, son of Jephunneh, represented Judah. The other 10 men were also tribal leaders, though most would become known primarily through what happened after their return. Moses sent all 12 from the wilderness of Paran with a detailed set of questions. They were to travel through the Negev and into the hill country. They were to determine what the land was like, whether its inhabitants were strong or weak, few or many, and whether the towns were open camps or fortified cities. They were also to inspect the soil and vegetation. Was the land good or poor, fertile or lean? Were there trees? Moses told them to be courageous and bring back some of the land's fruit. It was the season of the first ripe grapes, so their timing offered a visible way to test the land's agricultural promise. The instructions joined military intelligence with the practical concerns of settlement. Israel needed to know both what could sustain them and what stood in their way. The 12 traveled from the wilderness of Zin as far north as Rehob near Lebo-Hamath, surveying an extensive length of the country. They went up through the Negev and reached Hebron in the hill country. There they encountered Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. Hebron was ancient, and the narrative compares its age with Zoan in Egypt, anchoring the place in a world older than Israel's wilderness camp. Its inhabitants also supplied the kind of evidence that could be read in sharply different ways. The land was established and impressive, but formidable people occupied it. At a valley later called Eshcol, the men cut a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes so large that two of them carried it on a pole. They also collected pomegranates and figs. The name Eshcol, associated with a cluster, became attached to the place because of what Israel's representatives took from it. The fruit answered one of Moses' questions without the need for argument. This was a productive land. For 40 days, the 12 examined what lay ahead. Joshua saw the distances, the cultivated ground, the hill country, the settlements, and the fortifications. He saw both the abundance Israel desired and the strength that made possession dangerous. He had once been selected to choose fighting men against Amalek. Now he was one of 12 chosen to tell an entire nation what kind of fight awaited it. When the men turned back toward the wilderness, they carried the same evidence, but not yet the same meaning. The grapes, figs, and pomegranates could confirm that the promised land was good. The fortified towns and powerful inhabitants could confirm that taking it would be costly. Joshua had spent 40 days walking through the tension between those facts. Once the 12 reached the camp, what mattered would no longer be only what they had seen. It would be what they persuaded Israel to believe about it. The first words spoken on their return were encouraging. The 12 came to Moses, Aaron, and the whole congregation at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the assembled people and displayed the fruit they had carried back. The land did flow with milk and honey, they said, and here was its produce. Every representative had walked through the same country, and on this point there was no dispute. The land was capable of sustaining the future Israel had been promised. Then came the qualification. The people living there were strong. Their cities were fortified and very large. The descendants of Anak were there, and the scouts identified established populations across the regions they had crossed. Amalek occupied the Negev. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites lived in the hill country. Canaanites were positioned along the Mediterranean coast and beside the Jordan. The report turned the map into a ring of obstacles. Israel would not enter empty territory or confront one isolated enemy. Caleb intervened before fear could settle over the assembly. He quieted the people in Moses' presence and urged them to go up at once. Israel could certainly take possession of the land. The other scouts contradicted him. They said Israel was not able to attack those people because they were stronger. Their language then moved beyond measured intelligence into a destructive report about the land itself. The country explored for 40 days was now described as a land that devoured its inhabitants. They emphasized the great size of the people they had seen. The descendants of Anak became connected in their account with the Nephilim, figures whose name carried associations of an ancient and fearsome past. The scouts said that they had seemed like grasshoppers in their own eyes, and that this was how they must also have appeared to the inhabitants. That statement revealed the report's controlling perspective. The evidence had not changed. The scouts' estimate of Israel had. Years later, when Moses retold this crisis to the next generation, he recalled that the original proposal to send representatives had come from the people and had seemed good to him. Numbers presents the mission under divine command. Deuteronomy preserves the nation's desire to have the route and cities examined. Moses also remembered the scouts returning with fruit and declaring the land good. Yet the people refused to go. In their tents, they said that the Lord hated them and had brought them out of Egypt only to hand them over to the Amorites. The public report produced a night of weeping. The whole congregation raised its voice, and the sound spread through the camp. The Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron. They wished they had died in Egypt or already died in the wilderness. They asked why the Lord was bringing them into this land to fall by the sword. Their wives and children, they said, would become plunder. Egypt, which had recently been edited into a memory of abundant food, now became the destination they wanted back. Someone proposed the decisive reversal. They should appoint a leader and return to Egypt. This was more than hesitation over a military operation. Israel was rejecting its direction, its appointed leadership, and the purpose of the Exodus. The people had asked for information about the road ahead. Now they were using that information to renounce the journey itself. Moses and Aaron fell face down before the assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes. The two surviving advocates of entry did not deny the existence of fortified towns or powerful inhabitants. They declared that the land they had explored was exceedingly good. If the Lord delighted in Israel, he would bring them into it and give it to them. The people must not rebel, and they must not fear the inhabitants. The protection of those inhabitants was gone, Joshua and Caleb said, while the Lord was with Israel. Their appeal reached its limit almost immediately. The congregation discussed stoning them. Joshua's first public stand as one of the 12 representatives had placed him opposite the nation he was trying to persuade. At Rephidim, he had faced Amalek with selected men behind him. At Kadesh, his opponents were the people whose inheritance he was defending. The danger did not remain a dispute of competing speeches. It was moving toward the execution of the witnesses who refused to join the majority. Before the stones were thrown, the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting before all Israel. The visible intervention stopped the assembly and shifted the hearing away from the scouts. God asked Moses how long this people would despise him and how long they would refuse to believe despite the signs performed among them. He proposed striking Israel with pestilence, disinheriting the nation, and making from Moses a people greater and stronger than they were. Once again, Moses answered a threat of national destruction with intercession. He argued first from what Egypt and the nations would hear. They knew that Israel's God was present among this people, seen face to face, with the cloud standing over them and guiding them by day and night. If Israel were killed in the wilderness, the surrounding nations would not interpret the disaster as a judgment on rebellion. They would say that the Lord was unable to bring his people into the land he had sworn to give them. Moses then appealed to the character God had proclaimed, patient, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, yet not treating guilt as if it did not exist. He asked that Israel's sin be forgiven according to the greatness of that love, just as the people had been forgiven repeatedly from Egypt to this point. The appeal did not ask for the rebellion to be renamed as innocence. It asked that the nation not be destroyed by it. The answer came with both pardon and sentence. Israel would not be annihilated. Yet the adults who had seen God's glory, witnessed the signs in Egypt and the wilderness, and repeatedly tested him, would not see the land they had rejected. They had heard what the scouts said and treated the promise as a trap. They would receive the wilderness death they had chosen in their complaint. Caleb was singled out because he had a different spirit and followed faithfully. He would enter the land he had explored, and his descendants would possess their inheritance there. Joshua was also explicitly accepted from the sentence. Of the men counted from 20 years old and upward, the generation considered capable of bearing communal responsibility, only Joshua and Caleb would enter. The people's concern for their children was answered with a severe reversal. They had claimed that their sons and daughters would become plunder in Canaan. Those children would be the ones brought safely into the land. While their parents' bodies fell in the wilderness, the young would live as shepherds there until the unfaithful generation was gone. Their future had not been destroyed by the inhabitants of Canaan. It had been delayed by their parents' refusal to trust the path before them. The 40 days of exploration now set the measure of the judgment. Israel would bear the consequences for 40 years, 1 year corresponding to each day, until the wilderness had received the generation that rejected entry. It was not necessarily 40 additional years beginning at that hour. The period described the wilderness era as a whole. But Kadesh gave those years their meaning. A journey toward settlement became a prolonged passage through death. The sentence forced Joshua into a position unlike that of the rest of the camp. He would survive, but survival meant waiting while nearly every adult around him passed away. His truthful report did not permit him to advance alone. The promise was preserved for him, yet its fulfillment was tied to children who were not yet ready to take their parents' place. Joshua would have to live inside the consequence of a rebellion he had opposed. The 10 scouts who had spread the bad report did not enter that long waiting period. A plague struck them, and they died before the Lord. Their prominence as tribal representatives had magnified the effect of their words, and their judgment was immediate. Joshua and Caleb remained alive. The division within the scouting party was no longer a contest of 10 voices against 2. Only the 2 who had urged Israel forward were left to carry direct memory of the land into the wilderness years. When Moses reported the sentence, the people mourned bitterly, but mourning did not become submission. Early the next morning, some went up toward the heights and announced that they were ready to enter the place the Lord had promised. They admitted that they had sinned. Their confession sounded like a reversal, but they now attempted the very advance that had just been forbidden. The same people who would not move when commanded were determined to move after the command had changed. Moses warned them not to go. They were transgressing again, and the effort would not succeed. The Lord was not among them for this attack. Amalekites and Canaanites were ahead, and Israel would fall by the sword because it had turned away. The people had treated divine presence as irrelevant when fear told them to retreat. Now they treated it as unnecessary when regret drove them forward. They presumed to climb into the hill country. Moses did not leave the camp, and the Ark of the Covenant did not move with them. The army had no commission, no authorized leader, and no sign that Israel's God was advancing before it. The Amalekites and Canaanites came down, struck them, and pursued them as far as Hormah. The attempt ended in the military defeat the people had feared, but it came through disobedience rather than through the unavoidable strength of Canaan. In Moses' later retelling, the defeated men returned and wept, but the Lord did not listen to their cries. Israel remained at Kadesh for many days. The entrance that had stood before them was closed, and the route turned back toward the wilderness and the Red Sea. The land was still promised, its fruit still known, and Joshua was still destined to enter it. None of those facts shortened the sentence. Moses would later tell the next generation that Joshua, the man who stood before him, was the one who would enter and would cause Israel to inherit the land. He was to be encouraged. At Kadesh, however, that future was mostly burden. Joshua had seen Canaan and could describe its goodness, but he could not lead the nation there. He had survived the majority report, the threat of stoning, the judgment at the tent, and the reckless defeat in the hills. Now, he had to turn away from the country he had explored and walk back into the wilderness with a condemned generation. The years did what the sentence required. Israel moved through the wilderness, while the adult population that had refused the land gradually disappeared. Scripture records rebellions, judgments, deaths, and changes of leadership during that interval. But Joshua is rarely placed at the center of those scenes. His assigned task was not yet available to perform. He remained with Moses while children matured into households, younger men reached fighting age, and the nation that had wept at the scouts' report became a people whose direct memory of Egypt was fading. Near the end of the journey, Israel approached Canaan from the east and encountered kingdoms beyond the Jordan. Moses sent messengers to Sihon, king of Heshbon, requesting passage through his country. Israel offered to remain on the road, taking neither food nor water without payment. Sihon refused and mobilized his forces. At Jahaz, Israel defeated him and occupied his territory from the Arnon Gorge north toward the Jabbok, stopping at the Ammonite frontier. Farther north, Og, king of Bashan, came out with his army to fight at Edrei. His domain included fortified towns and fertile uplands extending toward Mount Hermon. Og was remembered as one of the last of the Rephaim, a people associated with extraordinary size. Deuteronomy even points to his great iron bed, displayed at Rabbah of the Ammonites, as a surviving object connected with him. Yet Israel defeated Og as it had defeated Sihon and took his cities. These victories changed the nation's position before it crossed the Jordan. The Israelites were no longer approaching the land as a people whose last attempt at invasion had ended in flight. They now controlled a substantial region east of the river. Moses later told Joshua to remember what he had seen happen to Sihon and Og, because the kingdoms west of the Jordan would be dealt with in the same way. Joshua's future confidence was to rest on recent events, not on a denial of the enemies ahead. On the plains of Moab, near the Jordan opposite Jericho, a second census was taken. Moses and Eleazar the priest counted the Israelite men 20 years old and upward who were able to serve in war. The total was 601,730, close to the size of the earlier fighting population, but composed of a different generation. The census was not merely a military calculation. It established the tribal proportions by which the land would be distributed. Larger tribes were to receive larger inheritances, smaller tribes smaller ones, with the location determined by lot. When the count was complete, the consequence announced at Kadesh could be measured. Among those now assembled, not one remained from the men counted by Moses and Aaron in the wilderness of Sinai, except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. The children once described as certain prey had become Israel's army. Joshua and Caleb stood among them as the two surviving representatives of the rejected opportunity. The census also exposed questions that military victory alone could not answer. Zelophehad, a man of the tribe of Manasseh, had died without a son. His 5 daughters, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, came before Moses, Eleazar, the leaders, and the congregation at the entrance to the tent of meeting. They argued that their father's name should not disappear from his clan simply because he had no male heir. They asked to receive property among their father's relatives. Moses brought their case before the Lord, and their claim was upheld. They were to receive their father's inheritance. The ruling then became a broader law for Israel. If a man died without a son, his inheritance would pass to his daughter, then through an ordered sequence of relatives if no daughter survived. Before the land had even been crossed, its distribution required a way to preserve a family's place within it. Joshua would inherit responsibility for more than defeating Canaanite armies. He would help administer a society rooted in tribal and household possession. The Eastern Territory soon raised a larger dispute. The tribes of Reuben and Gad possessed very large herds and saw that the regions of Jazer and Gilead were suitable for livestock. Their leaders approached Moses, Eleazar, and the chiefs and asked to receive land east of the Jordan rather than an inheritance across the river. The request sounded dangerously close to a refusal to enter Canaan. Moses confronted them with the memory of Kadesh. Would their fellow Israelites go to war while they remained behind? Their decision could discourage the whole nation, just as the scouts had discouraged their parents. Moses recounted the earlier rebellion, the sentence that followed, and the 40 years of wandering. If Reuben and Gad turned away now, they might bring another destructive delay upon Israel. The tribes answered with a binding proposal. They would build enclosures for their livestock and fortified settlements for their children, but their fighting men would arm themselves and cross at the front of Israel's forces. They would not return to their homes until every tribe had received its inheritance. Their wives, children, and herds would remain in the eastern towns, exposed to the risk of a campaign whose duration no one could yet know. Moses accepted the arrangement on those terms. If the eastern warriors crossed before the Lord and remained until the land was subdued, their possession in Gilead would be recognized. If they failed, their sin would find them, and they would have to receive property in Canaan with the others. Moses formally placed the agreement before Eleazar, Joshua, and the tribal family heads. Joshua was being made responsible for enforcing a promise negotiated before he assumed supreme command. Reuben and Gad repeated their commitment in the presence of those who would outlive Moses. The half-tribe of Manasseh also received territory east of the river, particularly the conquered areas of northern Gilead and Bashan. Reuben settled farther south, Gad in the central region, and half of Manasseh to the north. Their geographic separation from the other tribes began as a legitimate grant, but the Jordan would remain a physical boundary, capable of turning distance into suspicion. Instructions were also given for the land west of the river. Its outer boundaries were described from the wilderness of Zin in the south, along the Mediterranean in the west, toward the northern approaches, and back down the Jordan to the Salt Sea. 9.5 tribes would receive portions there because the others had already taken their inheritance eastward. Eleazar and Joshua were appointed to oversee the allocation, assisted by one leader from each participating tribe. Caleb was named for Judah, linking the coming distribution with the faithful minority at Kadesh. Moses' own remaining time had become short. He was told to climb the Abarim range and view the country from a distance. He would see the land, but would not lead Israel into it. At the waters of Meribah, Moses and Aaron had failed to uphold God's holiness before the people, and Moses would die outside Canaan as Aaron had. The leader who had interceded for Israel through repeated crises would share the wilderness endpoint without sharing the nation's entry. Moses did not answer by asking that his life be extended. He asked that God appoint a man over the congregation who could go out and come in before them, leading them out and bringing them in, so that the people would not be like sheep without a shepherd. The language embraced military command, but was not confined to it. Israel needed someone whose leadership could hold the tribes together through movement, battle, worship, and settlement. God identified Joshua, son of Nun, as a man in whom was the Spirit. Moses was told to take him, lay his hand upon him, and present him before Eleazar and the entire congregation. There Moses was to commission Joshua publicly and give him a measure of his authority so that all Israel would obey him. Joshua would stand before Eleazar, who would seek decisions through the priestly Urim. At that word, Joshua and the congregation would go out and come in. Moses carried out the command. He took Joshua, brought him before Eleazar and the assembly, laid his hands upon him, and commissioned him. The act did not make Joshua another Moses. His authority would operate within the covenant's existing structures, alongside the high priest and before the congregation. But the succession was no longer an implication preserved in old promises. Israel could now see the man appointed to lead it across the river. Moses reinforced that appointment in his final public addresses on the plains of Moab. He reminded the people that he was 120 years old and would not cross the Jordan. The Lord would go ahead of them, destroy the nations in their path, and give them the land. Joshua would cross at their head. Israel was commanded to be strong and courageous, refusing panic because God would not leave or forsake them. Then Moses summoned Joshua before the eyes of all Israel and directed the words personally to him. Joshua was to be strong and courageous because he would go with the people into the land sworn to their ancestors and would cause them to inherit it. The Lord would go before him and remain with him. Joshua must not fear or become dismayed. Moses wrote down the law and entrusted it to the priests and elders. Every seventh year during the Festival of Shelters, it was to be read publicly when Israel assembled, so that men, women, children, and resident foreigners could hear and learn. The written covenant was also placed beside the ark as a witness. Joshua's leadership would therefore be judged by something neither he nor any later ruler was free to rewrite. At the tent of meeting, the cloud appeared for another commissioning. Joshua stood with Moses as God warned that after Moses' death, Israel would turn toward other gods and break the covenant. The knowledge did not cancel the entry or Joshua's appointment. It made his responsibility more exact. He was to lead a people capable of receiving the land and abandoning the allegiance by which they held it. Moses then climbed from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the summit of Pisgah opposite Jericho. From there, he was shown the sweep of the country: Gilead, the northern regions, the territories toward the western sea, the Negev, and the Jordan Valley near Jericho. He saw the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he would not cross into it. Moses died there in Moab at the age of 120. His sight had not failed, and his vigor had not left him. He was buried in a valley, but the location of his grave was not preserved. Israel mourned him for 30 days until the formal period of grief ended. The narrative closes his life by saying that no prophet like Moses had arisen in Israel, one known by the Lord face to face and associated with the signs performed in Egypt and the acts of power witnessed by the nation. Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the Israelites listened to him. Yet the river still lay ahead, and Moses was no longer present to speak, intercede, or ascend into the cloud. The long apprenticeship was over. Joshua now stood opposite Jericho with the eastern tribes bound to their promise, the western inheritances waiting to be assigned, and an entire nation expecting him to move first. The first command came from the authority Joshua had served all his life. After Moses' death, the Lord addressed him directly. Moses, the servant, was dead. Joshua must now arise, cross the Jordan, and take the people with him into the land being given to Israel. There was no additional period of apprenticeship and no new human mediator to stand between Joshua and the responsibility. The fact of Moses' death became the signal to move. The territory was described on a scale larger than the ground immediately visible from the camp. It extended from the wilderness north toward Lebanon and from the Euphrates through the land associated with the Hittites to the Great Sea in the west. These were broad promised limits, not a claim that Joshua already controlled every place within them or would occupy each one during his lifetime. At that moment, Israel remained east of a flooded river, facing one fortified city. Joshua was assured that no opponent would be able to stand against him through the days of his life. The promise rested on continuity. As God had been with Moses, he would be with Joshua. He would not be abandoned or forsaken. Joshua was therefore commanded to be strong and courageous because he would lead the people to inherit the land sworn to their ancestors. Courage was also required for a less visible task. Joshua must carefully obey the law Moses had given, turning neither to the right nor the left. The book of the law was not to depart from his mouth. He was to meditate on it day and night, so that his actions would follow what was written. The success promised to him was not permission to improvise a new covenant around military necessity. The leader who would make decisions under pressure was to keep his speech, attention, and conduct anchored to instructions he had received. The command to be strong and courageous was repeated, now joined to a prohibition against terror and discouragement. Joshua was not promised that the land would look harmless. The walls opposite him remained walls, and the river remained in flood. Courage meant acting under command in the presence of those facts. The assurance was that the Lord his God would be with him wherever he went. Joshua responded by issuing orders. He directed the officers to pass through the camp and tell the people to prepare provisions. Within 3 days, they would cross the Jordan to enter and possess the land. The announcement gave the nation a short and definite horizon. Families had to ready themselves, provisions had to be organized, and tribes had to prepare for movement after years in which the destination had remained beyond reach. Joshua then addressed Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Their settlements behind the camp made their commitment especially important. He reminded them of the arrangement Moses had established. Their wives, children, and livestock could remain in the territory east of the Jordan, but their able warriors were to cross ahead of their fellow Israelites and assist them. They would not return home until the other tribes also possessed a place of rest. The eastern tribes answered without renegotiating the terms. They said they would do everything Joshua commanded and go wherever he sent them. As they had listened to Moses, they would listen to Joshua, asking only that the Lord be with him as he had been with Moses. Anyone who resisted Joshua's command or disobeyed his words would be put to death. They ended by repeating the charge Joshua had already received: be strong and courageous. Their response publicly secured the first possible fracture in the campaign. Men whose families and property were already settled could have treated the Jordan as the end of their obligation. Instead, they recognized Joshua's authority and accepted the risk of fighting for inheritances they would not personally occupy. Their obedience would still have to be demonstrated, but the transition from Moses had survived its first tribal test. Before moving the entire population, Joshua sought current intelligence about the western bank. From Shittim, he secretly sent 2 men to examine the land, giving particular attention to Jericho. The secrecy may have limited public exposure to their findings, a significant change from the 12-man mission that had spoken before the whole congregation. The text does not name these 2 scouts. Their task was to observe and return, not to represent 12 tribal constituencies in a public debate. Shittim lay in the plains east of the Jordan. Jericho stood across the river near the edge of the hill country, commanding access from the valley into the interior. Its surroundings formed a fertile oasis supplied by springs, a striking pocket of cultivation beside the lower Jordan. For an invading population approaching from Moab, Jericho was both the nearest major obstacle and a gateway. Israel could not simply regard it as one town among many. The 2 men crossed into the area and entered the house of a woman named Rahab. The narrative identifies her as a prostitute. It does not explain how the spies chose her house or provide a second occupation for her, although later readers have sometimes tried to soften the description. Her house was built into Jericho's wall, giving it a direct relationship to the city's defenses and, as events would show, a route outward. Their arrival did not remain secret. The king of Jericho was told that Israelite men had entered during the night to search out the land, and that they had come to Rahab's house. He sent orders to her: bring out the men, because they had come to examine the entire country. Jericho's authorities understood what the presence of scouts meant. Israel had defeated the kingdoms east of the Jordan, and its camp was now close enough to be watched. Rahab had already taken the 2 men to the roof and hidden them beneath stalks of flax laid out there. Flax was cultivated for its fibers and commonly spread for drying or processing. The piled stalks gave her a place to conceal the men without moving them beyond the house. When the king's representatives arrived, she acknowledged that the visitors had come to her but claimed that she had not known where they were from. She said the men had left at dusk as the city gate was about to close. She did not know which way they had gone. If the king's men pursued them quickly, she suggested, they could be overtaken. The deception sent the search party east toward the Jordan and the likely crossing places. Once the pursuers had gone out, Jericho's gate was shut. The spies remained inside a sealed city whose officials were now actively hunting them. Before the men settled for the night, Rahab went up to the roof. What she told them transformed the mission. She said she knew that the Lord had given Israel the land and that terror had fallen on its inhabitants. The people of the country were melting in fear. Her certainty about the outcome was stronger than anything the spies had yet reported to Joshua. Rahab explained what Jericho had heard. News of the Red Sea crossing had traveled far beyond the generation that experienced it. So had the destruction of Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings east of the Jordan. Those victories had not merely given Israel territory, they had shown the cities west of the river that the approaching nation could defeat established kingdoms. When the reports reached Jericho, courage drained from its people. No spirit remained in them to face Israel. She then made the recognition on which her request depended. The Lord, Israel's God, was God in heaven above and on earth below. Rahab did not present herself as someone entitled to protection by birth or innocence. She was a woman inside the first enemy city, speaking to agents whose presence threatened that city. Yet she interpreted the same events that frightened Jericho as evidence of who Israel's God was, and she acted on that conclusion before Israel crossed the river. Rahab asked the men to swear by the Lord that they would show loyal kindness to her family because she had shown kindness to them. She wanted a reliable sign that her father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all who belonged to them would be spared from death. The request expanded beyond her own survival. If she was risking her life by hiding Israel's spies, she wanted that risk to open a place of safety for her household. The men pledged their own lives as security for hers, provided she did not reveal their mission. When the Lord gave Israel the land, they would deal faithfully and kindly with her. The oath did not arise from a command Joshua had given before their departure, at least none that the narrative records. It was negotiated under pressure by the two unnamed men, and Joshua would later honor it. Rahab lowered them by a rope through the window because her house formed part of the city wall. The very structure intended to defend Jericho enabled its enemies to escape. She directed the spies away from the Jordan, where the king's search party had gone, and into the hills. They were to hide there for 3 days until the pursuers returned, then make their way back to Israel. Before leaving, the spies defined the sign by which their oath would be kept. Rahab was to tie a scarlet cord in the window through which she let them down. She must gather her father, mother, brothers, and her father's household inside her home. Anyone who went out into the street would bear responsibility for what happened there. If anyone inside the house was harmed, the guilt would rest on the spies. If Rahab disclosed their business, however, they would be released from the oath. She agreed to the terms and sent them away. Then she tied the scarlet cord in the window. Her house remained part of Jericho's outer wall, exposed at the point where the coming assault would first reach the city. The cord did not remove that danger. It marked the place where Israel's agents had promised that judgment would distinguish one household from the city around it. The spies reached the hills and stayed there for 3 days. The king's men searched along the road toward the Jordan and examined the fords, but found no one. After the pursuers returned to Jericho, the spies came down from the hills, crossed back over the river, and reached Joshua, son of Nun. No hostile force had intercepted them, and the woman who saved them had supplied the most important intelligence of the mission. They reported everything that had happened. Their conclusion was direct. The Lord had given the entire land into Israel's hands, and all its inhabitants were melting in fear. 40 years earlier, Joshua had returned from Canaan carrying evidence that the land was good, and had watched 10 companions turn its inhabitants into a reason for retreat. This time, the scouts returned from inside the enemy's walls, carrying confirmation that the fear ran in the other direction. Joshua now had the allegiance of the tribes, a report of collapsing enemy confidence, and a sworn obligation to rescue Rahab's household when Jericho was attacked. Yet the successful mission had not opened the road. The spies had crossed in secrecy as individuals. Joshua still had to bring priests, warriors, families, livestock, and the Ark of the Covenant through the swollen Jordan in full view of the city waiting on the other side. Joshua broke camp early the next morning. Israel moved from Shittim to the bank of the Jordan and stopped there before crossing. The river was not at its easiest seasonal level. It overflowed its banks throughout the harvest period, spreading beyond its usual channel and strengthening the barrier between the plains of Moab and the ground opposite Jericho. A pair of spies could cross by stealth and careful timing. Moving the nation required something altogether different. After 3 days, officers went through the camp with instructions. The people were to watch for the Ark of the Covenant, carried by the Levitical priests. When it moved, they were to leave their positions and follow it. A distance of about 2,000 cubits, roughly 900 meters or a little over half a mile, was to remain between the Ark and the population. That open space made its movement visible to a large assembly and prevented the tribes from crowding immediately around it. They had never traveled this way before. The officers did not distribute a route through the riverbed or direct each tribe to a known ford. The Ark would go ahead, and the people would know the path by following it. Its position at the front signaled that the crossing was bound to the covenant God had made with Israel. Joshua was commanding the operation, but he was not presenting himself as the one who would force open the river. Joshua told the people to consecrate themselves, because the Lord would do wonders among them the following day. Consecration prepared the community to approach a moment of divine action with the seriousness it required. The crossing would not begin as a panicked rush for the western bank. Israel would enter it as an ordered people, with priests, ark, tribes, and leader each given a place. Joshua then instructed the priests to take up the ark and pass ahead of the people. They lifted it on its poles and moved toward the river. At the same time, Joshua received an assurance concerning his own standing. Beginning that day, God would exalt him in the eyes of all Israel, so that the people would know that divine presence had accompanied him as it had accompanied Moses. That promise addressed a question no public ceremony could settle by itself. Moses had laid hands on Joshua, and the tribes had pledged obedience, but the nation had not yet followed Joshua through an event from which no ordinary leadership could deliver them. Moses' authority had been confirmed at the sea. Joshua's would be confirmed at the Jordan, not by reproducing Moses' role, but by leading Israel when the same God again made a path through water. Joshua told the priests that when they reached the edge of the Jordan, they were to stand in the river. He then summoned the people to hear what would happen. The coming sign would show that the living God was among them and would drive out the peoples occupying the land: Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. The Ark of the Covenant belonging to the Lord of all the earth would pass into the Jordan before them. 12 men, one from each tribe, were designated for a task that would become clear after the crossing began. Joshua then described the sign precisely enough for Israel to recognize it. As soon as the priests carrying the ark placed their feet in the water, the flow coming down from upstream would be cut off and stand in a heap. The nation would not wait for the river to subside naturally. The moment of contact would mark the interruption. The people struck their tents and moved toward the water behind the priests. When the feet of the ark-bearers touched the river's edge, the flow stopped. Far upstream, near Adam, a town beside Zarethan, the water rose in a heap. Downstream, the water running toward the Arabah and the Salt Sea was completely cut off. The interruption opened a long reach of channel rather than a narrow passage immediately beneath the camp. The priests carrying the ark advanced into the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground. The people crossed opposite Jericho. The text gives no confusion of wagons, animals, households, or tribal columns. It compresses the immense movement into a firm statement. All Israel crossed on dry ground. The priests remained stationary while the nation passed them, holding their place until everyone reached the western side. The location made the crossing visible to Israel's nearest enemy. Jericho stood west of the river, watching the plains through which the invading population would approach. The city's gate had already been shut against 2 suspected scouts. Now concealment was impossible. Israel was entering as an entire people, and the river that should have delayed or dispersed them had ceased flowing. Among those crossing were the armed men of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Approximately 40,000 equipped for war passed before the Lord onto the plains of Jericho. Their families and livestock remained in the towns east of the Jordan, but they fulfilled the first stage of their pledge by moving with the other tribes. Joshua did not have to begin the campaign by punishing eastern defection. The agreement made under Moses had become action under his successor. The people moved quickly through the exposed channel. The account emphasizes that the priests remained in the middle until everything was completed, that the Lord had ordered Joshua to tell the people in keeping with what Moses had commanded him. The crossing joined continuity and change. Joshua now gave the operational commands, yet he carried forward obligations received from Moses rather than separating his leadership from them. Once the population was safely across, Joshua called the 12 representatives, 1 from each tribe. He instructed them to return to the middle of the Jordan, to the place where the priests were standing, and lift 1 stone apiece onto their shoulders. The stones were to be carried to the camp where Israel would spend the night. Their number matched the tribes, so that the memory of the crossing would belong to the entire nation. The stones had a stated audience beyond the adults who saw the water stop. In the future, children would notice the monument and ask what the stones meant. Their parents were to explain that the Jordan's waters had been cut off before the Ark of the Covenant. The memorial would turn a child's question into the means by which eyewitness memory passed into inherited knowledge. The stones were to remain as a testimony among Israel. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the river itself, at the place where the priests had stood. The account says they remained there. Once the river returned, those stones would not function like the visible monument carried to camp. They marked the location inside the channel where the ark-bearers had held their position, a second trace of the passage beneath the water that would soon cover the riverbed again. The priests did not decide for themselves when to leave. Joshua received the command to order them out, and he told them to come up from the Jordan. Only after the people, the warriors, and the stone-bearers had completed their movement did the ark advance to the western bank. The priests lifted their feet from the dry riverbed and stepped onto land. At that moment, the waters returned to their course and overflowed the banks as before. The crossing place closed behind Israel. The nation had not merely reached a temporary island or moved to another wilderness camp along the eastern approach. The river resumed its full seasonal flow between the people and the territory where they had buried the previous generation. That day, Joshua was exalted in the sight of all Israel. The people revered him throughout his lifetime as they had revered Moses. The statement concerns recognized authority, not equality in every role or experience. Joshua had issued commands whose fulfillment the entire nation witnessed. The river opened, as he said it would. The priests held their station under his direction, and the people reached the land he had been appointed to give them. Israel came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal, on Jericho's eastern side. The date placed them 4 days before the time appointed for Passover. Their first encampment in the land therefore stood near a festival that remembered departure from Egypt. The generation born during the wandering had now completed the movement their parents had refused. Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones taken from the river. He repeated the explanation attached to them. When future children asked their fathers what the stones meant, Israel was to tell them that the nation crossed the Jordan on dry ground. The Lord had dried the river before them until they passed, just as he had dried the Red Sea for the earlier generation. The connection with the sea gave the crossing a wider purpose. The peoples of the earth were to know that the Lord's hand was mighty, and Israel was to fear him continually. The event looked outward toward the inhabitants watching Israel's arrival and inward toward the nation that had crossed. It demonstrated power to both, but it did not guarantee that either would respond faithfully. At Gilgal, the monument gave the camp a fixed point of memory before a single western city had been taken. Joshua now possessed something he had never held at Kadesh. The people had followed, the eastern warriors had kept faith, and the nation stood with him on Canaanite soil. His authority had survived the transition from command to action. Yet reaching the western bank did not mean Israel was prepared to attack. The men of war had crossed, but a large part of the new generation still lacked the covenant sign given to Abraham. The calendar was moving toward Passover, and Jericho's walls remained closed nearby. Before Joshua could direct his army against the city, the nation had to stop in exposed country and address what the wilderness years had left undone. The exposed pause became possible because the crossing had already affected the enemy. The Amorite kings in the hill country west of the Jordan and the Canaanite kings nearer the Mediterranean heard that the river had dried up until Israel crossed. Their courage failed, and no spirit remained in them to confront the Israelites. Jericho stayed shut, but its rulers now knew that the flooded river had not protected their eastern approach. At Gilgal, Joshua received instructions to make flint knives and circumcise the Israelite males. The command describes this as circumcising Israel a second time, meaning a corporate restoration of the covenant sign, not that the same men were to undergo it twice. Those who had come out of Egypt had been circumcised, but the males born during the wilderness journey had not. The fighting generation that crossed the Jordan therefore carried an omission extending across the years of wandering. Joshua carried out the circumcision at a place called Gibeon-Haraloth, the hill of foreskins. The timing created an obvious military vulnerability. The men had entered hostile territory, established camp within reach of Jericho, and then accepted a procedure requiring them to remain in place until they healed. The text does not describe an enemy attack during this interval. The fear produced by the Jordan crossing held the surrounding powers back, while Israel attended to the covenant before battle. Once the circumcision was complete, the Lord told Joshua that the reproach of Egypt had been rolled away from Israel. The place was therefore called Gilgal, a name associated with rolling. The precise shade of that reproach is not fully explained. It may include the disgrace of slavery, Egypt's expectation that the freed population would perish, or the uncircumcised condition allowed during the wandering. What matters in the scene is the declared change. Israel stood in the Promised Land as a covenant people ready to begin a new stage. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, the Israelites observed Passover on the plains of Jericho. The feast linked their position beside the closed Canaanite city with the night their families had prepared to leave Egypt. This generation had not stood inside those first houses with blood-marked doorways, but it now ate the memorial meal after completing the journey that departure had begun. The day after Passover, Israel ate food grown in the land, unleavened cakes and roasted grain. Then the manna ceased. For decades, it had appeared with the dew and sustained a population without fields of its own. It did not fail prematurely in the wilderness, and it did not continue once the land produced food for them. The people would no longer gather it. From that year onward, they ate the produce of Canaan. The transition altered daily life before it altered the military map. Israel was no longer being fed as a mobile wilderness camp. Grain from Canaan entered its meals, even while Canaanite cities remained occupied. The land had begun to sustain the people who were about to fight for possession of it. Near Jericho, Joshua looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword. Joshua approached and asked the question a commander needed answered. Was this figure for Israel or for its enemies? The reply was no. The man identified himself instead as commander of the army of the Lord and said that he had now come. Joshua fell face down and bowed. He asked what his Lord had to say to his servant. The commander instructed him to remove his sandals because the place where he stood was holy. Joshua obeyed. The exchange echoes the holy ground on which Moses had received his call, but Joshua was not told that the heavenly commander had come to serve Joshua's strategy. Israel's leader found himself addressed as a servant on the eve of his first siege. The narrative does not give the figure a personal name or describe the army under his command. It leaves Joshua before an armed presence whose authority exceeds the visible forces in his camp. The encounter settles the order of command without supplying a conventional battle plan. That plan came next, and it depended on disciplined movement rather than the known methods of breaching a fortified city. Jericho was tightly shut because of Israel. No one went out, and no one came in. The city that had sent pursuers after the spies had sealed itself against the population now camped nearby. Its wall protected houses, inhabitants, stores, and the king's forces. Rahab's window remained within that defensive structure, marked by the scarlet cord and by an oath known to only a few Israelites. Joshua was told that Jericho, its king, and its warriors had been given into his hand. The army was to march around the city once each day for 6 days. 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horn trumpets would walk before the ark. On the 7th day, the procession would circle the city 7 times. The priests would then sound a prolonged blast, the people would shout, and the wall would collapse so that the troops could advance directly inward. Joshua summoned the priests and relayed the instructions. They were to take up the ark with the 7 trumpet-bearing priests in front. Armed men would move ahead of them, while a rear guard followed the ark. The formation placed warriors around the covenant procession, but the repeated sound heard from the city would come from priestly trumpets rather than from an assault against the gates. Joshua imposed silence on the people. They were not to shout or let their voices be heard until he gave the order. Thousands could march around the walls, but no taunts, negotiations, threats, or battle cries were authorized. The only continuing sound was the blowing of the horns as the procession completed its circuit. On the first day, the ark was carried around Jericho once, then everyone returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua rose early the following morning. The priests again lifted the ark, the 7 trumpeters went before it, the armed guard moved ahead, and the rear guard followed. They circled the city and returned to camp. The same action continued for 6 days. Jericho's defenders saw Israel approach, surround the walls in ordered silence, and withdraw without attacking. The account records no sortie from the city and no change in Joshua's instructions. Each circuit required the army to remain under a command whose military effect was not yet visible. On the 7th day, Israel rose at dawn and marched around Jericho in the same formation, but this time the procession did not turn back after one circuit. It went around the city 7 times. Only on that day did the people make repeated circuits. The priests continued sounding the trumpets while Joshua held the nation to the sequence he had been given. During the 7th circuit, the priests sounded the long blast. Joshua told the people to shout because the Lord had given them the city. He also declared the terms under which Jericho was being taken. The city and everything in it were placed under the ban, devoted to destruction. Rahab alone was to live, together with everyone gathered inside her house because she had hidden the messengers. Joshua gave a specific warning about the property of the city. Israel must keep away from what had been devoted. or the people would bring the same condition upon their own camp and make it liable to destruction. Silver, gold, bronze, and iron were to enter the treasury of the Lord. They were not available as private rewards for soldiers. The first victory west of the Jordan would produce no personal plunder. The distinction made obedience inside Israel part of the battle's outcome. Jericho had been declared given, but the manner in which Israel received it still mattered. The city's wealth could not be detached from the judgment pronounced upon it. What any individual took in secret would implicate more than the person who carried it away. At Joshua's signal, the people shouted. The wall collapsed, and the troops went up into the city, each advancing straight ahead. Jericho's continuous defensive barrier no longer forced the army toward a gate or a single breach. The Israelites entered from around the perimeter and captured the city. Joshua 6 describes the destruction in comprehensive terms. Men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys were put to the sword. The account presents Jericho as a city under the ban, not as a population absorbed into Israel after surrender. It offers no casualty count and pauses for no individual scenes inside the city. The exception it follows is the household protected by the oath. Joshua directed the two men who had explored the land to enter Rahab's house and bring out the woman and everyone belonging to her. The responsibility returned to those who had pledged their lives for hers. They went into the breached city and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all her relatives. Everyone gathered under the marked roof was removed before the city was burned. Rahab and her family were initially placed outside Israel's camp. Their rescue from Jericho did not instantly erase the boundary between a Canaanite household and the consecrated nation. Yet Rahab was not sent away after the battle. The narrative says that she lived among Israel from then onward because she had hidden the messengers Joshua sent. The Israelites burned Jericho and what remained inside it. The silver, gold, bronze, and iron vessels were placed in the treasury as commanded. The city that had blocked the approach from the Jordan was no longer an operating stronghold, and the oath made on its wall had survived the wall's collapse. Joshua pronounced a curse on anyone who attempted to rebuild Jericho as a fortified city. The rebuilder would lay its foundation at the cost of his firstborn and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest. Jericho's ruins were to remain a warning rather than immediately becoming another defended center on the same strategic site. The Lord was with Joshua, and news of him spread throughout the land. His first Western victory had been won without siege ramps, a prolonged blockade, or a negotiated surrender. The people had obeyed the order of march, Rahab's household had been preserved, and the city's metals had been assigned to the treasury. But Jericho's fall placed a severe command inside the victorious camp. Thousands had passed through a city filled with objects no one was permitted to claim. Joshua could inspect the burned walls and the public treasury. He could not see every decision made in private while the army moved through the ruins. Israel left Jericho with its first stronghold behind it, and with the consequences of the devoted things now resting on the obedience of each soldier. One soldier had not left Jericho empty-handed. Achan, son of Carmi, from the Zerahite line within the tribe of Judah, had taken objects placed under the ban. No one reported him, and nothing in Joshua's first decisions after Jericho suggests that he knew. The narrator reveals the violation before Joshua discovers it. Israel had acted unfaithfully regarding the devoted things, and the Lord's anger burned against the nation. The next objective was Ai, a smaller settlement east of Bethel, near Beth-aven. Reaching it meant climbing away from the low Jordan Valley toward the central hill country. Jericho had controlled the entrance from the plains. Ai stood along the route into the highlands. Joshua again sent men to inspect the target, and they returned with an assessment shaped by its size. The entire army would not be needed. The scouts recommended sending only 2,000 or 3,000 men. Ai's population was small, they said, so there was no reason to make all Israel labor in the attack. After the collapse of Jericho's walls, the recommendation would have sounded practical. Joshua sent approximately 3,000. There is no record that he sought guidance before accepting the scouts' estimate or that the ark accompanied the force. The operation proceeded as a limited military action against an apparently limited enemy. The men of Ai drove Israel back. About 36 Israelites were killed, and the survivors were pursued from the city gate as far as Shebarim and struck down on the descending slope. The number of dead was far smaller than the population that had entered Jericho, but these were the first recorded combat deaths of the campaign west of the Jordan. The psychological effect spread far beyond the size of the casualty list. Israel's courage melted and became like water. The language previously used for the inhabitants of Canaan now described the invading nation. Jericho's fall had made the land fear Israel. Ai's resistance showed that Israel could turn and run. If news traveled through Canaan as quickly as the earlier reports had reached Rahab, one defeat could encourage every city still waiting to see whether Joshua's advance could be stopped. Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down before the ark. The elders of Israel joined him, placing dust on their heads. They remained there until evening. The leader whose authority had been confirmed at the river now lay before the covenant chest while men were buried after a battle he had ordered. He did not yet know that the cause lay inside the camp. His prayer began with the crossing itself. Why had the Lord brought this people over the Jordan only to deliver them into the hands of the Amorites? Joshua said that it would have been better to remain east of the river. The words echoed the wilderness habit of looking backward when danger appeared, but Joshua did not propose retreat. He was trying to understand how a promised advance had produced a routed army. He asked what he could say now that Israel had turned its back before its enemies. The Canaanites and the other inhabitants would hear of it, surround the camp, and erase Israel's name from the land. Then Joshua's appeal reached the issue Moses had raised in intercession. What would happen to God's great name? The defeat threatened not only the army's position, but the meaning the nations would assign to Israel's presence. The answer did not begin with reassurance. Joshua was told to stand up. Israel had sinned. The people had violated the covenant, taken what was devoted, stolen it, lied about it, and placed it among their own possessions. The hidden act had passed through several stages. An object forbidden to private ownership had been removed, concealed by deception, and absorbed into an Israelite household as though no command attached to it. That was why Israel could not stand before its enemies. The people had made themselves liable to the same destruction placed upon Jericho, and they would continue turning their backs until the devoted things were removed. Divine presence would not simply cover the violation while Joshua refined his tactics. The military problem could not be corrected on the battlefield because its cause was buried beneath a tent. Joshua was told to consecrate the people for the following day and announce the reason. Something devoted was among them. Israel would not be able to stand against its enemies until it was taken away. In the morning, the nation would present itself by tribes. The tribes selected would approach by clans, then households, then individual men. The process would reduce a national crisis to the person responsible. The offender caught with the devoted things would be burned along with all belonging to him because he had transgressed the covenant and committed an outrageous act in Israel. The command treated Achan's theft as more than unauthorized looting. Jericho's destruction had been carried out under a stated condition. By keeping part of what was banned, Achan had brought that condition back into the camp. Joshua rose early and brought Israel forward tribe by tribe. Judah was taken. Within Judah, the clan of the Zerahites was taken. The families of the Zerahites came near, and the household line of Zabdi was selected. Finally, the men of that household came forward one by one, and Achan, son of Carmi, was taken. The narrowing took place before the assembled community. Joshua did not begin by announcing the name supplied to the reader or by searching tents until valuables appeared. The identification moved through Israel's recognized structure, from tribe to clan, from clan to household, and from household to one man. By the time Joshua spoke to Achan, the army's defeat and the concealed property had been joined in public. Joshua addressed him as my son. He told Achan to give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and to give him praise by telling what he had done. He must hide nothing. The words offered no promise that confession would remove the announced judgment. They demanded that secrecy end and that the truth of the selection be acknowledged by the selected man himself. Achan confessed. He said that he had sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. Among the spoil, he had seen a beautiful mantle from Shinar, 200 shekels of silver, and a gold bar weighing 50 shekels. Shinar was associated with Mesopotamia, making the garment an object of distant origin and likely value. The metals represented portable wealth. In the ruins of Jericho, the 3 items could be carried away and concealed by one person. Achan described the movement of his decision plainly. He saw the objects, coveted them, and took them. They were hidden in the ground inside his tent with the silver underneath. No one had forced the choice, and no uncertainty about the command appears in his explanation. Desire had turned objects assigned to destruction and sacred use into private property. Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to Achan's tent. The hiding place was exactly where he said it would be. The mantle and gold were buried with the silver beneath them. The messengers removed the objects, brought them to Joshua and the Israelites, and spread them out before the Lord. What had been visible only to Achan inside Jericho, then concealed beneath his family's living space, was now exposed before the nation. The search established that the defeat at Ai had not resulted from an imaginary charge or a leader's attempt to divert blame. The forbidden property physically connected the confession to the command Joshua had given before Jericho fell. Joshua and all Israel took Achan to a valley along with the silver, the mantle, and the gold bar. They also brought his sons, daughters, oxen, donkeys, sheep, tent, and everything he possessed. The account does not say whether his family members knew what was beneath the tent. It presents the household and property together within the judgment brought upon the man who had made his home the hiding place. In Israel's tribal world, a household was an economic and social unit, not merely a collection of isolated individuals sharing an address. Achan had attempted to place devoted objects within that unit. The consequence now reached the unit in which he had concealed them. The severity is stated without a separate inquiry into the knowledge of each family member. Joshua asked Achan why he had brought trouble upon Israel. The Lord, he said, would bring trouble upon him that day. The accusation named the effect of the theft. 36 men had died at Ai, the army had fled, and the entire campaign had been endangered by property hidden where Joshua could not see it. Israel stoned them, burned them, and covered them with stones. The language gathers Achan, his household, and his possessions into a single act of judgment. Over the remains, the people raised a large heap of stones. As with the monument at the Jordan, the pile remained as a physical witness, but its lesson came from failure inside Israel rather than deliverance through the river. The place became known as the Valley of Achor, the Valley of Trouble. Achan's name and the valley's name preserved the connection between private violation and communal disaster. Only after the devoted objects had been exposed and judgment carried out did the Lord's fierce anger turn away. The crisis had corrected Joshua's understanding of command. A favorable report about an enemy's weakness could not guarantee victory, and a small engagement could not be treated as detached from the covenant governing the whole nation. Every soldier carried Israel's obligations into battle, including the obligations no commander could monitor by sight. Ai still stood in the highlands. Its defenders had killed Israelite men, pursued the survivors down the slope, and watched Joshua's first assault collapse. The city now had reason to expect another attack, and confidence drawn from the first one. Joshua, however, could return knowing why Israel had failed. The camp had been cleansed, but the defeat would not be reversed by explanation alone. He still had to lead the army back up the same road. The order to return came with the reassurance Joshua had needed before the first assault. He was told not to fear or be dismayed. This time he was to take the entire fighting force with him and go up to Ai. The city, its king, its people, and its territory had been given into his hand. Israel would do to Ai and its king what it had done to Jericho, with one important change. The livestock and other spoil could be taken. The permission exposed the waste within Achan's choice. He had seized objects from the one city whose property was forbidden, and his theft had cost him everything. At the next city, the soldiers would be allowed to keep plunder under command. Israel's warriors did not have to guess whether all captured property was permanently prohibited. They had to receive or refuse it according to the terms given for each battle. Joshua was also instructed to place an ambush behind Ai. He prepared the army accordingly, selecting experienced warriors for the concealed force and sending them out by night. The battle account refers first to 30,000 chosen men, and later identifies 5,000 stationed west of Ai, between the city and Bethel. It does not fully explain how the two figures relate within the deployment, but its arrangement is clear. A hidden Israelite force waited behind Ai while Joshua approached openly from the north. Joshua warned the ambush not to position itself too far from the city and to remain ready. He and the visible force would advance until Ai's defenders came out against them. Then Israel would flee as before. The enemy would assume that Joshua's army was repeating its earlier defeat and would pursue. Once the city had been drawn away from its defenses, the concealed troops would rise, capture it, and set it on fire. The plan used Ai's recent victory against it. Its defenders had seen 3,000 Israelites turn down the slope and had chased them successfully. Joshua would now present the same image, inviting the king to act on knowledge that had been true once. Ai's confidence was not irrational, it was incomplete. Joshua spent the night among the people and rose early to muster the army. He and the elders led the force toward Ai, approaching from the north and camping with a valley between them and the city. The ambush had taken position to the west. Joshua then went into the valley, making the visible threat impossible for Ai's watchmen to ignore. When the king of Ai saw Israel's position, he and the men of the city hurried out early for battle at an appointed place facing the Arabah. He did not know that another force was waiting behind the city. The defenders were looking toward Joshua, the leader they had already driven away once. Their attention moved in the direction the plan required. Joshua and the visible army allowed themselves to be beaten back and fled toward the wilderness. The men of Ai were called out to pursue them. As Joshua withdrew, the defenders followed farther from the city. The account says that no man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. The gate was left open, and the city's protection moved into the chase. Then the Lord told Joshua to stretch out the javelin in his hand toward Ai, because the city was being delivered to him. Joshua extended it. The ambush saw the signal, rose quickly, entered the undefended city, and set it on fire. Smoke began rising behind the pursuing army. The men of Ai looked back. The city they had left open was burning, and the smoke climbed into the sky. They had no direction in which to escape. The Israelites who had been fleeing stopped and turned against their pursuers. At the same time, the force that had captured the city came out to meet them from behind. Ai's army was trapped between the two Israelite groups. The apparent retreat had become an encirclement. Israel struck the defenders until none escaped. The king alone was taken alive and brought to Joshua. The city's successful pursuit had emptied its defenses, separated its army from shelter, and delivered its ruler into the hands of the man it had previously humiliated. After the field force was destroyed, the Israelites returned to Ai. The account places the entire population under the same ban imposed upon Jericho, giving a total of 12,000 men and women killed that day. Joshua kept the javelin extended until the destruction was complete. The weapon in his hand served as the maintained signal under which both parts of the army carried out the operation. Israel took the livestock and spoil for itself as authorized. The permission did not lessen the completeness of the victory. It distinguished what could be retained from what had to be destroyed. The soldiers now handled captured goods without bringing the ban back into their tents. Obedience reached the same practical point at which Achan had failed, but the command had changed. Joshua burned Ai and reduced it to a permanent mound of ruins. The city's name itself sounded like the Hebrew word for a ruin, and the account presents its destruction as making that description a physical reality. Jericho remained behind Israel in the valley. Ai no longer blocked the ascent into the central highlands. The king's body was hanged on a tree and left there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered it taken down, in accordance with the law's concern that an exposed body not remain overnight. The Israelites threw the corpse at the entrance to the city gate and raised a large pile of stones over it. The gate from which Ai's defenders had poured out now became the resting place of its king. Stone heaps were accumulating along Joshua's route, but they did not all carry the same meaning. One marked passage through the Jordan, another marked the judgment of Achan in the Valley of Trouble. This one covered the defeated ruler of Ai. The landscape was becoming a record of deliverance, violation, and reversal, each attached to a place Israel had physically entered. With Ai taken, Joshua led the people farther into the hill country toward Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim near Shechem. The book of Joshua places this journey immediately after the victory, though it does not describe the route, the reaction of nearby settlements, or the military arrangements that made the gathering possible. Its narrative purpose is direct. Before the campaign widens, Israel must enact the covenant ceremony Moses had commanded. Joshua built an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal. It was made from whole stones that had not been shaped with iron tools. On it, Israel presented burnt offerings and peace offerings. The first expressed complete dedication. The second allowed covenant fellowship around a sacrifice. After 2 cities had been destroyed, the nation gathered not for a victory monument to Joshua, but for worship under the law given through Moses. There, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. The leader who had been told to keep that law in his mouth now placed it before the people in the land itself. The written words connected the inheritance to obligations that existed before Israel possessed a single Canaanite city. The entire assembly then took its appointed position. The priests carrying the ark stood in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. The elders, officers, and judges gathered with the people. Half the tribes stood facing Mount Gerizim for the blessing, and half faced Mount Ebal for the curse, following the arrangement Moses had prescribed. The geography turned the covenant into a public scene. The 2 mountains rise on opposite sides of the valley near Shechem, creating facing slopes around the central assembly. Israel had entered the land far enough to stand within that natural formation and hear the consequences of obedience and disobedience spoken over the nation. Joshua read all the words of the law, including the blessings and the curses. The account emphasizes that he omitted nothing Moses had commanded. Women, children, and resident foreigners were present, along with the fighting men. Rahab's household had been brought out of Jericho and was now living among Israel. The covenant community was already being confronted with the question of how people from outside Canaan's doomed cities could enter its life. The blessings and curses gave Israel's victories their governing meaning. Possessing towns did not place the people beyond judgment. The same covenant that promised life in the land warned that rebellion could make Israel suffer there. Ai had already demonstrated the principle on a small and immediate scale. When Israel violated the command, its enemies prevailed. When the offense was removed and the command followed, defeat was reversed. The ceremony did not turn Joshua into a priest or a lawgiver. He built, wrote, and read in obedience to what Moses had transmitted. His leadership joined military authority with responsibility for public instruction. The man holding the javelin toward Ai was the same man who now ensured that the entire community heard the covenant's words. No summary of the law could replace the reading, so the narrative does not shorten Joshua's act into a private consultation among leaders. Everyone who shared Israel's life was placed within hearing. The campaign would affect households, fields, towns, worship, justice, and relations between tribes. The covenant addressed the people who would live with those consequences, not only those carrying weapons. When the assembly ended, Israel remained deep enough in Canaan to have crossed from the Jordan Valley into the central ridges. Jericho and Ai had fallen by radically different operations. One collapsed after ritual circuits, the other was taken through a planned ambush. Neither method could be turned into a fixed formula for every enemy ahead. Joshua's constant was the command governing the situation, not the repetition of a successful tactic. The surrounding peoples now faced more than rumors from east of the river. Israel had established itself inside the land, defeated a fortified gateway, recovered from a public reversal, and gathered at the mountains near Shechem. Some kings would answer by preparing for open war. Another population would study what had happened to Jericho and Ai and decide that survival required approaching Joshua before he approached them. Israel had just heard every word of the covenant, but the next decision would depend on recognizing the truth inside a carefully constructed lie. The deception began with objects chosen to tell the same story. Men from Gibeon loaded worn sacks and old wineskins onto their donkeys. The skins were cracked and repaired. Their sandals were worn and patched, their clothes threadbare, and the bread they carried was dry and crumbling. Everything about the delegation suggested damage accumulated over a long road. They came to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal and claimed to have traveled from a distant country. They asked Israel to make a covenant with them. The Israelites immediately raised the relevant question: what if these men actually lived nearby? Israel could not make a treaty that protected inhabitants of the land it had been commanded to possess. The delegates avoided naming their home. They called themselves Joshua's servants. When he pressed them who were they and where had they come from, they repeated that they had traveled from a very distant country because of the fame of Israel's God. They had heard what happened in Egypt and what Israel had done to Sihon and Og east of the Jordan. Their version of events stopped there. They did not mention Jericho or Ai, the recent disasters that would have exposed how close their home must be. Instead, they pointed to the material evidence. Their elders and countrymen, they said, had sent them with fresh bread, but it had become dry and crumbly. The wineskins had been new when filled, yet now they were split. Their clothes and sandals had worn out during the very long journey. Israel's leaders examined the provisions. They did not seek counsel from the Lord. Joshua made peace with the delegation and established a covenant, allowing their people to live. The leaders of the congregation confirmed the agreement with an oath. The disguised men received exactly the protection they had come to obtain. 3 days later, Israel learned that the supposed distant travelers were neighbors. They belonged to Gibeon and its associated towns, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. The Israelites set out and reached those cities on the third day, proving how little distance the weathered props had actually covered. The congregation did not attack because the leaders had sworn an oath by the Lord, the God of Israel. The people complained against their leaders, but the oath could not be treated as meaningless simply because it had been obtained through deception. The leaders decided that the Gibeonites must live so that wrath would not fall upon Israel for violating the sworn agreement. Joshua summoned them and asked why they had deceived him by claiming to live far away. Their towns lay within Israel's reach. Because of the deception, he declared, they would remain under a curse of servitude, supplying wood and water for the house of God. The Gibeonites answered that they had received clear reports of the command given through Moses to grant Israel the land and destroy its inhabitants. They had feared for their lives and acted accordingly. Now they were in Joshua's hands. He could do whatever seemed good and right to him. Joshua preserved them from the Israelites. From that day, the Gibeonites served as woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation and for the altar at the place God would choose. Their deception changed their status, but achieved its central purpose. They survived. Like Rahab, they had concluded that Israel's advance would succeed. Unlike Rahab, they secured protection by constructing a false identity and drawing Israel into an oath without full knowledge. The failure to seek counsel carried an unexpected consequence. Joshua's mistaken treaty became a real obligation, and honoring it soon required Israel to risk a major battle. Gibeon had separated itself from the other Canaanite cities, and its peace with Israel threatened the security of the surrounding hill country. Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and placed it under the ban as he had Jericho. He also heard that Gibeon had made peace with Israel and remained among them. This frightened him because Gibeon was a large city, comparable to one of the royal cities and larger than Ai. Its men were known as capable warriors. If a city of that strength joined Joshua, the balance in the region could shift rapidly. The king of Jerusalem sent messages to 4 other rulers: Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon. He called them to join him in attacking Gibeon because it had made peace with Joshua. The 5 Amorite kings assembled their armies and laid siege to the city. The Gibeonites sent an urgent appeal to Joshua at Gilgal. They called themselves his servants and asked him not to abandon them. He must come quickly, save them, and help them because all the Amorite kings of the hill country had gathered against them. The servants assigned to cut wood and draw water were now invoking the protection contained in Israel's oath. Joshua responded by marching from Gilgal with the entire army, including his best fighting men. The route from the Jordan Valley toward Gibeon climbed sharply into the Central Highlands. He did not use the questionable origin of the covenant as grounds to leave the city to its fate. The promise to let Gibeon live now required him to defend it. Joshua was told not to fear the coalition. The kings had been given into his hand, and none would be able to stand before him. He marched through the night from Gilgal and arrived unexpectedly. The 5 armies that had gathered to punish Gibeon suddenly faced Joshua's full force. After an approach they had not stopped, the Lord threw the coalition into confusion before Israel. Joshua's army struck them at Gibeon and pursued them along the ascent toward Beth-horon, then down toward Azekah and Makkedah. The route crossed steep and difficult ground, turning the battle into a running collapse across the hill country. As the Amorites fled down the descent of Beth-horon, large hailstones fell upon them from the sky. More died from the hail than Israel killed with the sword. The storm struck the retreating coalition during its flight, extending the destruction beyond the reach of Joshua's nearest troops. During the battle, Joshua spoke before Israel. He called for the sun to stand still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Aijalon until the nation had taken vengeance on its enemies. The account says that the sun stopped and the moon halted until Israel prevailed. It cites the Book of Jashar, an ancient source no longer preserved, as another record of the event. The narrative describes an extraordinary prolonging of daylight, approximately a full day, without explaining a physical mechanism. Its emphasis falls on the result and on the uniqueness of the occasion. There had been no day like it before or afterward, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man in this way. The Lord fought for Israel, and the coalition could not use the ordinary end of daylight to escape pursuit. The 5 kings fled and hid in a cave at Makkedah. When their location was reported, Joshua ordered large stones rolled across the entrance and guards stationed there. He did not stop the pursuit to deal with captured rulers while their armies were still escaping. The soldiers were to continue, strike the rear of the fleeing forces and prevent them from reaching their cities. Israel pursued until the enemy suffered a devastating defeat. The survivors who escaped entered fortified towns. Joshua's troops then returned safely to him at the camp near Makkedah. The account says that no one dared speak against the Israelites. The force that had once fled from Small Ai could now complete a night march, break 5 combined armies, and return intact. Joshua ordered the cave opened and the 5 kings brought out. He summoned the commanders who had gone with him and told them to place their feet on the kings' necks. The act made the coalition's reversal visible. These rulers had assembled to destroy a city under Joshua's protection. Now they lay subdued before the officers who would continue the campaign. Joshua told his commanders not to fear or become discouraged. They were to be strong and courageous, because this was what the Lord would do to all the enemies they fought. He then struck the kings, killed them, and hanged their bodies on 5 trees until evening. At sunset, the bodies were taken down and returned to the cave. Large stones sealed the entrance and remained there as another wartime memorial. Makkedah itself was taken that day. Joshua captured the city and its king and placed its population under the ban. The campaign then moved from one southern center to another before the defeated kingdoms could recover or form a second coordinated defense. From Makkedah, Joshua advanced to Libnah and captured it. From Libnah, he moved to Lachish and fought against it. Lachish fell on the second day. Horam, king of Gaza, came to assist Lachish, but Joshua defeated him and his army. The intervention did not save the city and added another defeated ruler to the campaign. Israel next moved against Eglon, one of the cities whose king had joined the coalition. From Eglon, Joshua went up into the higher country to Hebron, the ancient city the scouts had visited decades earlier, and the place associated with the descendants of Anak. Hebron was taken, and its surrounding settlements were struck. Joshua then turned toward Gibeon and captured it as well. The account summarizes the southern sweep as extending through the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the slopes with their kings. It names territory from Kadesh Barnea toward Gaza and from Goshen toward Gibeon, describing a broad regional victory rather than the permanent occupation of every settlement in the south. Joshua captured these kings and territories in one sustained campaign because the Lord fought for Israel. The campaign began with a rescue forced upon him by an oath obtained through deception. By honoring that oath, Joshua was drawn into the confrontation that broke the southern coalition. The sequence did not erase the consequences of Israel's earlier mistake. Gibeon remained protected within the land, and its people remained bound to service. But the treaty no longer looked like a private embarrassment that could be quietly discarded. It had altered alliances, provoked war, and required Joshua to make Israel's word costly enough to be credible. After the southern operations, Joshua and the army returned to the camp at Gilgal. Jericho, Ai, and the principal southern coalition had been defeated, but the campaign had also advertised the danger of allowing Israel to fight one kingdom at a time. Farther north, Rulers with larger forces and access to chariots now had every reason to assemble before Joshua could reach them separately. The northern answer came from Hazor. Its king, Gibeon, heard what had happened in the south and sent messages across the region. He contacted Jobab, king of Madon, the rulers of Shimron and Akshaph, and kings from the northern hill country, the Arabah south of the Sea of Chinnereth, the western foothills, and the heights near Dor on the Mediterranean side. The summons extended across peoples and terrain. Canaanite rulers from east and west joined Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites from the hills, along with Hivites living near Mount Hermon in the region of Mizpah. The coalition gathered at the waters of Merom, north of the Sea of Chinnereth. Its size is compared to the sand along the seashore, and it possessed many horses and chariots. This was a different military threat from the five-king alliance broken near Gibeon. Chariots were expensive instruments of organized power, most effective where terrain allowed them to maneuver. Israel had emerged from the wilderness as a largely infantry force. If Joshua allowed the northern coalition to choose open ground, coordinate its chariots, and maintain its numerical strength, the campaign could be stopped far from Gilgal. Joshua was told not to fear them. By the same time on the following day, the coalition would be delivered to Israel. He was also given an unusual instruction concerning its military equipment. The horses were to be hamstrung and the chariots burned. Israel would not absorb the enemy's chariot force and turn it into the foundation of its own security. The weapons making the coalition appear overwhelming were to be rendered unusable. Joshua and his army came upon the gathered forces suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked. The Northern Alliance did not receive the extended preparation its scale might have encouraged it to expect. Israel struck the coalition at its assembly point, and the massed force broke before it could convert numbers and machinery into control of the battlefield. The Israelites pursued westward toward Great Sidon and Misrephoth-Maim, and eastward into the valley of Mizpah. The directions of flight show the coalition scattering across the north instead of withdrawing as a unified army. Joshua struck the fugitives until the organized force was destroyed. He then carried out the command concerning the horses and burned the chariots. The decision removed valuable assets that a victorious army might naturally claim. At Ai, Israel had been permitted to take livestock and spoil. Here, the chariot system itself was marked for destruction. The campaign would continue without making Joshua dependent on the military structure he had just defeated. Joshua turned back toward Hazor. The city had been the head of the coalition and the leading kingdom among its partners. Its political importance made it more than one captured town in a long sequence. Joshua killed Jabin and placed the city under the ban, then burned Hazor. The other captured cities in that phase were not burned in the same way. Israel took their livestock and spoil while destroying the forces and populations placed under judgment. Hazor alone is singled out for fire because it had organized the northern resistance. The center from which the coalition had been assembled could not immediately resume that role. The campaign expanded through the regions Moses had assigned to Joshua. The narrative names the hill country, the Negev, the land of Goshen in the south, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their lower slopes. It stretches the field from Mount Halak toward Seir in the south to Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon beneath Mount Hermon in the north. Joshua captured the kings who came against him and put them to death. The text repeatedly connects his actions with what Moses had commanded. Moses had received the instructions. Joshua executed them across terrain Moses had only viewed from outside the land. The succession was now visible on the map, as well as in Israel's leadership. This did not happen in one uninterrupted rush. The account explicitly says that Joshua waged war against these kings for a long time. The tightly written sequences compress repeated marches, encampments, sieges, supply movements, tribal deployments, and seasons of fighting. Scripture does not supply a campaign calendar from which every city's fall can be assigned an exact date. Gibeon and its associated towns remained the exception among the cities described. No other city made peace with Israel. The other rulers met Israel in battle and were taken in that confrontation. The narrative attributes their hardened resolve to divine judgment, saying their hearts were strengthened to come against Israel so that they would receive no negotiated mercy. That statement places the war within the theological judgment presented by Joshua, while the human decisions remain visible in the story. Kings heard what happened, measured the threat, formed alliances, and marched armies into the field. Gibeon sought survival through submission and deception. The coalitions chose armed resistance. The book does not treat those actions as outside divine rule, but neither does it erase them from the chain of events. Joshua also moved against the Anakim in the hill country. These were the people whose size had dominated the report given at Kadesh. Their presence had become the image through which the earlier generation judged itself too small to enter. Joshua cut them off from Hebron, Debir, Anab, and the mountain regions associated with Judah and Israel. The reversal reached back across the wilderness years. Joshua was no larger than he had been when he first saw the descendants of Anak, and the fortified hill country had not become imaginary. What changed was that the feared population no longer controlled Israel's decision. The obstacle that once helped turn a nation back now became part of the campaign Joshua completed. Even this victory contained a geographical limit. Anakim remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod along the coastal region. The statement prevents the summary from being read as though every associated group had vanished from every surrounding territory. Joshua broke their power within the central inheritance, while enclaves survived beyond the areas then secured. The land was said to have rest from war. This meant that the large coalitions confronting Joshua had been defeated, and that no comparable organized force was then contesting Israel's entry. It did not mean that every town was occupied, every boundary controlled, or every surviving population removed. Later events would show how much local possession remained to be accomplished. The record then pauses to assemble the defeated kings into a formal survey. Joshua 12 is not another day-by-day campaign narrative. It functions as a collected ledger, joining victories achieved under Moses east of the Jordan with those achieved under Joshua to the west. The placement gives Israel a political map of resistance overcome without claiming that the names are arranged in the exact order of battle. East of the Jordan, the list begins with Sihon, king of the Amorites, who ruled from Heshbon over territory extending from the Arnon region toward the Jabbok and the borders of Ammon. It then names Og, king of Bashan, whose authority included Ashtaroth, Edrei, parts of Gilead and the northern highlands. Moses had defeated these two kings and given their land to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. West of the Jordan, the ledger begins with Jericho and Ai. It then names Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, Eglon, and Gezer, many of them tied to the southern coalition. Debir, Geder, Hormah, Arad, Libnah, Adullam, and Makkedah extend the record across the south and foothills. Bethel, Tappuah, Hepher, Aphek, and Lasharon mark additional centers whose individual battles the narrative has not described. The northern names include Madon, Hazer, Shimron-Meron, and Akshaph, followed by Tanakh and Megiddo near the major routes of the Jezreel region. Kadesh, Jokneam near Carmel, Dor on the coast, a king associated with Goyim, and Tirzah complete the western roster. The total is 31 kings. Some names belong to scenes already given substantial space. Others appear only in the list. The difference reflects literary selection rather than proof that the unnamed battles were effortless or unimportant. Jericho, Ai, Gibeon, the Southern Coalition, and Hazor explain decisive changes in the campaign. The ledger gathers the broader result around those selected events. Calling these men kings does not require imagining 31 rulers with empires on the scale of Egypt. Canaan's political landscape was divided among city-centered kingdoms, each ruler exercising authority over a fortified center and its surrounding settlements. Defeating many kings therefore meant dismantling a network of local powers rather than overthrowing one central Canaanite state. The list also reveals why coalitions mattered. No single city controlled the whole country, so Israel's advance could provoke several different alliances at different times. Jerusalem could organize the southern highlands. Hazor could rally the north. Once those centers and their partners were defeated, no national Canaanite government remained to replace them. Joshua took the land in the sense defined by the campaign. He defeated the kings who opposed Israel, seized their principal centers, and ended the coordinated military resistance described in the book. The comprehensive language of the summaries sits beside details showing survivors, unburned cities, coastal strongholds, and territory still outside Israelite control. The land was conquered as a theater of royal opposition, but it was not yet fully possessed as a settled inheritance. That difference now determined Joshua's next responsibility. Warfare had brought Israel across the river and broken the forces capable of driving it back. It had not placed every tribe inside defined boundaries, resolved competing claims, or supplied local control over all the regions named in the promise. By the time the campaign record had accumulated, Joshua was old and advanced in years. The man who had waited through the wilderness had spent another long interval in war. He was told directly that much land still remained to be possessed. The statement did not revoke the victories or deny the rest from large-scale conflict. It changed the work before him. Joshua could not wait until every surviving enclave had been removed before assigning the inheritance. The tribes would have to receive land that included both secured territory and unfinished responsibility. The army's shared campaign was giving way to a settlement in which each tribe would confront what remained within its own portion, and Joshua now had to draw those portions before his own years ran out. The first step was to name what conquest had not accomplished. The remaining territory included the coastal regions associated with the Philistine rulers of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, together with adjoining Canaanite lands. Farther north, Sidonian territory, the region around Gebal, the Lebanon range, and approaches extending toward Lebo Hamath also remained beyond Israelite control. Joshua was told that these lands would still belong within Israel's inheritance. God would drive out their inhabitants, and Joshua must allocate the territory among the tribes even before that process was complete. 9.5 tribes would receive portions west of the Jordan. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh already possessed the land Moses had assigned them on the eastern side. The command separated allotment from immediate occupation. Joshua was not being asked to pretend that coastal cities had fallen or that northern peoples had disappeared. He was being told to define each tribe's responsibility within the Promised Land. A boundary could therefore include towns Israel did not yet govern. Receiving an inheritance meant receiving both a gift and the unfinished work attached to it. Before the western lots were drawn, the eastern grants were formally reviewed. Reuben's territory lay farthest south, beginning near the Arnon Gorge and including the plateau around Medeba and Heshbon. These were lands formerly ruled by Sihon. The Jordan formed Reuben's western boundary, placing its settlements across the river from the southern part of Canaan. Gad received territory farther north through Jazer and portions of Gilead. Its towns extended through the Jordan Valley and toward the southern end of the Sea of Chinnereth. Places such as Beth Haram, Beth Nimrah, Sukkoth, and Zaphon placed Gad along routes connecting the river valley with the uplands to the east. Half of Manasseh occupied northern Gilead and Bashan, including the former domain of Og. The inheritance was associated especially with the descendants of Machir, Manasseh's firstborn. Jair's settlements and the region around Ashtaroth and Edrei gave the half-tribe a broad, elevated territory beyond the Jordan. Within Manasseh's inheritance, the ruling won by Zelophehad's daughters now became land rather than a future legal promise. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah came before Eleazar, Joshua, and the leaders. In obedience to the command given through Moses, they received an inheritance among their father's brothers. A case brought before the tent during the final wilderness days now preserved a family's name inside the settled map. Levi received no single tribal territory comparable to the others. The Levites' inheritance was connected with the offerings and service of the Lord, and their towns would later be distributed within the portions of the other tribes. This prevented one continuous Levitical region from occupying the map while placing priestly and teaching communities throughout Israel. Moses had assigned the eastern lands. The western distribution belonged to Joshua, Eleazar the priest, and the tribal heads. The territories were apportioned by lot at Gilgal, combining proportional tribal claims with a process Israel understood as placing the final location beyond private bargaining. The first western lot fell to Judah. Before Judah's boundaries were fully recorded, Caleb approached Joshua with men from his tribe. The two old scouts now stood together in the land they had once urged Israel to enter. Caleb reminded Joshua of what the Lord had spoken through Moses at Kadesh Barnea concerning them. Caleb had been 40 years old when Moses sent him to explore the country. He said that he returned with a report corresponding to what was in his heart, while the other scouts made the people's hearts melt. Caleb had followed the Lord fully, and Moses swore that the land on which Caleb had walked would become an inheritance for him and his descendants. 45 years had passed since that promise, including the wilderness wandering and the campaigns in Canaan. Caleb was now 85. He declared that he remained as strong as he had been when Moses sent him out, still able to go out and come in for war. The statement is Caleb's own assessment, offered before Joshua and the tribe that would have to recognize his claim. He asked for the hill country, where the Anakim and their large fortified cities had been seen. Caleb did not request an easy retirement on ground already cleared by someone else. He asked for the place most closely connected with the obstacle that had terrified the earlier generation. If the Lord was with him, he said, he would drive its inhabitants out. Joshua blessed Caleb and granted him Hebron. The city and its surrounding region became his inheritance because he had followed the Lord faithfully. Hebron carried ancestral associations reaching back to Abraham, but for Joshua and Caleb, it also carried the memory of the scouting mission. The territory once used as evidence against entry became the portion awarded to the man who refused that argument. Caleb's claim did not mean that every inhabitant of Hebron had already been removed. He drove out Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the three descendants of Anak named when the scouts first passed through the area. The text thus places the old names on both sides of the wilderness divide. They were present when Caleb was 40, and their hold on Hebron ended when he was 85. From Hebron, Caleb moved against Debir, formerly called Kiriath Sepher. He offered his daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who captured the city. Othniel, son of Kenaz, a relative within Caleb's clan, took it and received Achsah as his wife. The settlement of Judah's inheritance was proceeding through family action, as well as through the national army. When Achsah came to Caleb, the narrative says she pressed for a field to be requested and then approached her father herself. She dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb asked what she wanted. Achsah requested a blessing. Because he had given her land in the Negev, a comparatively dry region, she asked him also to provide springs of water. Caleb granted both the upper and lower springs. The episode is brief, but it shows inheritance becoming usable property. A field on a map was not enough if a household lacked reliable water. Achsah identified what her portion required and secured it from the man controlling the grant. Judah's larger allotment stretched from the wilderness of Zin and the border of Edom in the south to the territory of Benjamin in the north. The Salt Sea marked much of the eastern side, while the Mediterranean formed the western boundary. Between them lay the Negev, the western foothills, and the central hill country. The southern line passed through the ascent of Akrabim, continued toward Zin and Kadesh Barnea, and turned through settlements and wadis toward the Mediterranean. This placed the scene of Israel's old refusal near the edge of Judah's inheritance. Kadesh Barnea, once the point from which the nation retreated, now helped define the territory of the tribe whose faithful scout had urged advance. The northern boundary began near the Salt Sea and ran through a complicated sequence of springs, valleys, ridges, and towns toward the coast. It passed near Jerusalem and through locations connected with the hill country before reaching the sea. Such descriptions were practical claims, not decorative geography. They identified where one tribe's responsibilities ended and another's began. Judah's town lists group settlements by region. The Negev in the south, the lowland toward the west, the hill country, and the wilderness descending toward the Dead Sea. Some named cities had already appeared in Joshua's campaigns. Others entered the story only through the allotment record. Their inclusion did not mean that Israel had necessarily occupied each one at the moment the boundary was drawn. The coastal plain exposed that difference most clearly. Judah's assigned territory reached toward Philistine centers whose strength remained. A city could be included within the promised portion while still requiring later conflict. The map described Israel's claim and obligation more completely than its current control. Jerusalem revealed the same problem in the highlands. Judah did not dislodge the Jebusites living there, and the text says, they continued living with the people of Judah in Jerusalem. Later, biblical accounts preserve additional fighting over the city and associate the continuing Jebusite presence, especially with Benjamin. The notices are not arranged as a complete day-by-day history of Jerusalem's control. Together, they show that no early victory produced simple, permanent possession of the entire city. This was not a minor exception hidden outside Judah's useful land. Jerusalem occupied a strategic ridge near the boundary between Judah and Benjamin. Its survival demonstrated that even central highland territory could contain an enclave beyond full tribal authority. The allotment therefore produced a mixed picture. Caleb received Hebron and drove out the Anakim associated with it. Othniel captured Debir. Achsah obtained the water needed for her household's land. At the same time, Jerusalem remained shared with an unconquered population, and western centers continued outside Israelite control. Joshua had converted national victories into the beginning of local inheritance. The promise now had names, borders, families, fields, springs, and unfinished towns. Judah's faithful representative received the place he had requested, but the tribe's broader portion would demand courage from people who could no longer leave every battle to Joshua's central army. The next claims would come from the house of Joseph, Joshua's own tribal world. Ephraim and Manasseh were numerous, influential, and already represented on both sides of the Jordan. Their allotments would test whether strength and status produced willing possession or demands that Joshua solve the difficult parts of inheritance for them. Ephraim's lot came first within the house of Joseph. Its southern boundary rose from the Jordan near Jericho into the central highlands, passed through the region of Bethel, and continued west toward lower Beth Horon and Gezer before reaching the Mediterranean. Ephraim also received towns located within Manasseh's larger territory, reflecting how closely the two Joseph tribes were interwoven. Yet Ephraim did not drive the Canaanites out of Gezer. The inhabitants remained among them and were subjected to forced labor. Israel gained power over the city's population without completing the removal assigned to the tribe. Forced labor offered an immediate economic benefit, making continued Canaanite presence useful enough to tolerate. Manasseh received a much broader area north of Ephraim, extending from the Jordan Valley across the hill country toward the coast. Its position adjoined Asher in the north and Issachar in the east. Within those neighboring regions, Manasseh was also assigned important towns with their surrounding villages, including Beth-shean, Ibleam, Dor, Endor, Tanach, and Megiddo. These cities controlled fertile valleys and major routes, and Manasseh could not initially take possession of them. The Canaanites remained determined to live there. When Israel became stronger, the inhabitants were placed under forced labor, but they were not driven out. As at Gezer, growing power produced control without full obedience. The descendants of Joseph then approached Joshua with a complaint. They asked why he had given them only one lot and one portion when they were numerous and had been greatly blessed. Their concern was not imaginary. Ephraim and Manasseh together formed a large population, and their inheritance included difficult highlands and strong Canaanite centers. Joshua answered their claim by taking it seriously on its own terms. If they were numerous, they could go up into the forested hill country occupied by Perizzites and Rephaim and clear land for themselves. They did not need to remain compressed within the most accessible part of their allotment. Their size gave them the labor and fighting strength required to expand into the territory already assigned. The Joseph tribes replied that the hill country was insufficient. They pointed to the Canaanites in the valley, especially around Beth-shean and the valley of Jezreel, who possessed iron chariots. The chariots made the open lowlands more dangerous than wooded slopes. Israel had already destroyed the chariot force gathered by Hazor, but individual tribal possession still faced the same technology in local strongholds. Joshua did not grant them a second easy territory taken from another tribe. He told Ephraim and Manasseh that they were indeed numerous and powerful. The forested hill country would be theirs, and they could clear it to its farthest limits. The Canaanites in the valleys could also be driven out despite their iron chariots and military strength. His answer joined privilege to responsibility. The house of Joseph could not cite its numbers as a reason to receive more, while treating those same numbers as inadequate for difficult possession. Joshua, himself an Ephraimite, gave his own tribal house no exemption from the pattern already visible in Judah. The allotment identified the inheritance. The tribe had to act within it. The center of national life then moved to Shiloh in Ephraim's hill country. The whole congregation assembled there and set up the tent of meeting. Unlike the temporary camp at Gilgal near the Jordan, Shiloh stood more centrally within the land. The sanctuary's presence made it the place where unresolved tribal claims could be settled before the Lord. 7 tribes had still not received their inheritances. Joshua confronted their delay. How long would they remain slack about going in to possess the land given to them? The major campaigns were over, but the absence of a hostile coalition did not automatically turn unassigned territory into functioning tribal homes. Joshua ordered each of the 7 tribes to appoint 3 men. These 21 representatives would travel through the remaining country, describe it according to its towns and natural divisions, and return with a written survey. The land would then be divided into 7 portions. Judah would remain in its territory to the south, and the house of Joseph in its territory to the north. The surveyors went through the land and recorded its towns in 7 sections on a scroll. They returned to Joshua at Shiloh, where he cast lots before the Lord. The process replaced indefinite waiting with defined portions. Every remaining tribe would leave with a geographic responsibility it could no longer describe as someone else's decision. Benjamin received the first of the 7 lots. Its territory lay between Judah and Joseph, occupying a narrow but strategically important strip across the Central Highlands. The boundary descended toward the Jordan near Jericho and climbed west through the ridges around Jerusalem before continuing toward Kiriath Jearim. Benjamin's towns included Jericho, Bethel, Gibeon, Ramah, Mizpah, and Jerusalem, among others. Several had already played major roles in the campaign, while others remained contested or shared with surviving populations. Benjamin's inheritance connected the Jordan Valley with the Central Ridge and placed the tribe among locations that would remain politically important long after Joshua. Simeon received the second lot. Its inheritance lay within Judah's territory because Judah's original portion was larger than the tribe required. Simeon's towns included Beersheba, Molada, Hazar Shual, Ezem, Ziklag, and settlements across the southern region. Giving Simeon towns inside Judah adjusted the first allotment without erasing Judah's boundaries. The distribution was not too rigid to respond when the original proportions proved excessive. It also meant that Simeon would live within a stronger tribe's southern territory rather than along a completely independent frontier. Zebulun received its portion in the lower Galilean region. Its boundary passed among towns and ridges, connecting the interior with routes toward the west. The allotment included 12 towns with their villages. The description is less familiar than the campaigns around Jericho and Jerusalem, but it placed Zebulun within the northern landscape whose ruling coalition Joshua had broken. Issachar's land covered part of the fertile Jezreel region and included towns such as Jezreel, Shunem, and En-Haddah. Its boundary reached toward the Jordan Valley. The agricultural potential was considerable, but the nearby Canaanite centers assigned to Manasseh showed that fertile valleys could remain difficult to control even after the regional kings were defeated. Asher received a long western territory reaching toward the Mediterranean and northward along the coast. Its boundary connected Carmel, the region around Akko, and approaches toward Sidon. The allotment contained 22 towns and their villages. Much of the coast remained beyond firm Israelite possession, so Asher's map included access to maritime country that the tribe would still have to secure. Naphtali received a northern portion stretching through Upper and Lower Galilee, with the Jordan forming part of its eastern edge. Its towns included fortified centers such as Ziddim, Hamath, Rakath, Chinnereth, Kedesh, and Hazor. The name of Hazor now appeared inside an inheritance after the city's king and coalition had been defeated. Dan received the 7th lot in the western region near Judah, Ephraim, and Benjamin. Its assigned towns included Zorah, Eshtaol, Aijalon, Ekron, and others extending toward the area of Joppa. This placed Dan near strong populations and routes leading to the coastal plain. The record of Dan's allotment also includes a later expansion. When the tribe's territory proved difficult to hold, Danite forces went north, attacked Leshem, captured it, and renamed it Dan after their ancestor. Joshua places this notice within the allotment record without giving a precise date relative to the original distribution. It anticipates how tribal possession could change after Joshua's central work was finished. With the tribal lots assigned, the Israelites gave Joshua his own inheritance. He had distributed land to every tribe west of the Jordan before receiving a town for himself. At his request, he was given Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. Joshua rebuilt the town and settled there. The leader who had spent his life moving between camps, battles, mountains, and tribal assemblies finally received a defined place inside the land. His inheritance was not a royal capital detached from his tribe. It was a town within Ephraim, granted by the people whose portions he had administered. The distribution concluded at the entrance to the tent of meeting in Shiloh, under the oversight of Eleazar, Joshua, and the tribal family heads. The national map was now complete in legal form. Every tribe had a portion, even where possession remained incomplete, and Joshua had accepted his own, only after the others were settled. But borders alone could not preserve life within those territories. Israel now consisted of tribes spread across the Jordan, hill country, valleys, southern drylands, and northern approaches. Accidental bloodshed could ignite clan vengeance. Levites without a continuous territory still needed places to live. Distance from Shiloh could weaken shared identity, and one misunderstood structure could divide east from west. The inheritance had been drawn. The next task was to keep the tribes from destroying one another inside it. The first protection addressed blood vengeance. Joshua was told to appoint the cities of refuge Moses had prescribed. If someone killed another person unintentionally, without prior malice, the killer could flee to one of these cities rather than be immediately killed by the dead person's avenger. The fugitive was to stand at the city gate and present the case to its elders. They would admit the person and provide a place to live among them. If the avenger arrived, the elders could not simply surrender the accused. The killing had to be examined before the congregation, distinguishing accidental death from murder. If the assembly found no murderous intent, the fugitive remained protected within the city. That residence continued until the death of the high priest serving at the time. Only then could the person safely return home. The arrangement preserved the family's right to pursue justice while interrupting a cycle in which retaliation could occur before facts were heard. 3 refuge cities were designated west of the Jordan: Kadesh in Naphtali's Galilean territory, Shechem in Ephraim's hill country, and Kiriath Arba, or Hebron, in Judah. 3 corresponding cities stood east of the river: Bezer in Reuben's plateau, Ramoth in Gilead within Gad, and Golan in Bashan within the half-tribe of Manasseh. Their distribution placed access on both sides of the Jordan and across Israel's north-south length. The protection applied not only to native Israelites, but also to foreigners living among them. A person's distance from Shiloh or tribal ancestry was not to determine whether an accidental killing received a hearing. The Levite family heads then came to Eleazar, Joshua, and the tribal leaders at Shiloh. They appealed to the command given through Moses that the Levites receive towns in which to live, together with surrounding pasture lands for their animals. Since Levi had no continuous tribal portion, these towns had to come from the inheritances already assigned to the other tribes. Lots distributed the settlements among the 3 major Levitical divisions. The priestly descendants of Aaron, belonging to the Kohathite line, received 13 towns from Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin. These included Hebron, already designated as a refuge city. Caleb retained the surrounding fields and villages belonging to his inheritance, while the Levites received the town and its pasture lands. Other Kohathite families received 10 towns from Ephraim, Dan, and western Manasseh. The Gershonites received 13 from Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and eastern Manasseh. The Merarites received 12 from Reuben, Gad, and Zebulun. Altogether, 48 towns with pasture lands were assigned to Levi. The patterns scattered Levitical households through the tribal map. They would live inside territories belonging to others, serving at designated places and preserving the law's presence beyond the central sanctuary. The same towns could also support systems of refuge, worship, and instruction within regions separated by difficult travel. At this point, Joshua gives a broad assessment of the settlement. The Lord had given Israel the land sworn to its ancestors. The people had taken possession and settled there, and rest had been granted from surrounding enemies. Not one of the good promises made to Israel had failed. All had come to pass. The summary speaks from the level of the national achievement. Israel had crossed, defeated the major coalitions, received defined inheritances, and established towns and institutions throughout the land. It does not erase the book's own notices about surviving Canaanites and unoccupied territory. The promise had decisively become Israel's possession, while the tribes still carried responsibility for completing possession within it. Joshua then summoned the warriors of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. They had left their households east of the Jordan and fought beside the western tribes throughout the long campaign. Joshua told them that they had done everything Moses commanded and had obeyed his own orders. They had not abandoned their fellow Israelites during the many days of war. Now the Lord had given their brothers rest, and the eastern warriors could return to their tents in the territory Moses assigned them. Joshua did not release them with military praise alone. He warned them to keep the commandment and law, to love the Lord, walk in his ways, obey his commands, cling to him, and serve him with all their heart and soul. Joshua blessed them and sent them home. He also directed them to carry substantial wealth from the campaigns, livestock, silver, gold, bronze, iron, and clothing, and share the spoil with their relatives. The men who had crossed the river were returning not as displaced auxiliaries, but as tribes whose service had been honored and whose eastern inheritance remained legitimate. The half-tribe of Manasseh embodied the geographic complexity of the settlement. One half lived in Bashan, east of the Jordan under the grant made by Moses, while the other half occupied land west of the river under Joshua's allocation. A single tribal ancestry now extended across the boundary, capable of separating Israel's communities. The eastern warriors departed from Shiloh and traveled toward Gilead. When they reached the region of the Jordan within Canaan, they built an altar beside the river. It was large and conspicuous, a structure that could be seen and discussed from a distance. News reached the western tribes that Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh had built a great altar on the frontier near the Jordan. The report did not include the eastern tribes' explanation. To the hearers, the structure looked like a rival place of sacrifice erected immediately after the warriors left the sanctuary at Shiloh. The whole western congregation assembled at Shiloh to go to war against them. The same men who had fought side by side through Canaan now prepared for conflict across the river. The issue was not treated as a private architectural choice. An unauthorized sacrificial altar could divide Israel's worship and bring covenant judgment upon the nation. Before armies moved, Israel sent a delegation. Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, led it, accompanied by 10 tribal chiefs, one from each western tribe. These men were heads of their ancestral families. The investigation, therefore, carried priestly and tribal authority rather than arriving as an informal complaint. At Gilead, the delegation accused the eastern tribes of committing a breach of faith. How could they turn away by building an altar in rebellion against the Lord? They invoked the sin at Peor, where Israel's unfaithfulness had brought a plague whose effects the community still remembered. A tribal offense could become a national disaster. They also invoked Achan. One man had acted unfaithfully concerning the devoted things, but wrath had fallen on the congregation, and he had not been the only person to die. That memory gave the western tribes a concrete reason to fear concealed disobedience. They had already learned that waiting for judgment to expose a violation could cost lives. The delegation offered an alternative. If the eastern land was somehow unclean or unsuitable for faithful worship, the tribes could cross into the land where the tabernacle stood and receive property among the western tribes. They should not rebel against the Lord or against Israel by building a separate altar. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh answered with a solemn appeal to God's knowledge. The mighty one, God the Lord, knew their purpose, and Israel should know it as well. If the altar had been built in rebellion or unfaithfulness, they did not ask to be spared. They denied that the structure was intended for burnt offerings, grain offerings, or peace offerings. If that had been their purpose, the Lord could demand an account. The altar was not a substitute for the authorized altar associated with the tabernacle. Their concern ran in the opposite direction from what the western tribes feared. The Jordan formed a strong natural boundary. In future generations, Western Israelites might tell the children of the eastern tribes that they had no share in the Lord because they lived beyond the river. Geography could be turned into a claim that Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh did not truly belong to Israel. The eastern tribes had therefore built a copy of the altar as a witness. It was not for sacrifice. Its form testified that both sides shared the same God and the same authorized worship. If later descendants questioned the eastern tribes' place in Israel, the structure would answer that their ancestors had a legitimate share in the service of the Lord. They declared it unthinkable that they should rebel by presenting offerings on an altar other than the one before the tabernacle. The structure that looked like a declaration of independence had been intended to prevent exclusion. Both sides feared covenant division. They had simply read the same stones in opposite ways. Phinehas and the tribal chiefs accepted the explanation. They were pleased with what they heard. Phinehas said that they now knew the Lord was among Israel because the eastern tribes had not committed the suspected breach. By clarifying their purpose, they had delivered the nation from the judgment that rebellion would have brought. The delegation returned west and reported to the congregation. The people blessed God and abandoned the plan to invade Gilead. No altar was torn down, no tribe was punished, and no Israelite blood was shed. Investigation had reached the intention before war acted on the appearance. The eastern tribes gave the altar a name identifying it as a witness that the Lord is God. It stood beside the river as evidence of shared allegiance, though the crisis had shown how quickly distance and incomplete knowledge could turn fellow tribes into presumed enemies. Joshua had nearly watched the united inheritance collapse into civil war just as the soldiers were returning home. The institutions of settlement had worked, recognized leaders traveled, evidence was heard, and a truthful explanation prevented violence. But those institutions depended on a loyalty that could not be assumed forever. With the tribes dispersed and Joshua nearing the end of his life, he still had to tell Israel what no boundary, city, or monument could guarantee after he was gone. Joshua waited until Israel had enjoyed a long interval of rest, then summoned its elders, leaders, judges, and officers. He was now very old. The campaigns and allotments were behind him, and the people before him would soon have to govern their tribes without the man who had brought them across the Jordan. He reminded them that they had seen what the Lord had done to the nations they fought. The remaining peoples had also been included within the tribal inheritances from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. Israel must hold firmly to what was written in the law of Moses, turning neither right nor left. The leaders were not to merge their allegiance with the surviving nations. They must not invoke those nations' gods, swear by them, serve them, or bow before them. They were to cling to the Lord, as they had until then. Israel's victories had not come from superior numbers. One Israelite had been able to chase 1,000 because the Lord fought for them. Joshua told them to guard themselves carefully by loving the Lord their God. If they turned back, joined the remaining peoples through marriage, and bound their life to them, those nations would no longer be driven out. They would become snares, traps, scourges, and thorns until Israel disappeared from the good land it had received. He then spoke with the directness of a dying man. He was going the way of everyone on earth. The leaders knew in their hearts that not one good promise made to Israel had failed, but the covenant's warnings were as real as its gifts. If Israel violated it and served other gods, the good land would not shield the people from judgment. Joshua later gathered all the tribes at Shechem. The elders, family heads, judges, and officers presented themselves before God in the valley where Israel had earlier heard the blessings and curses. This time, Joshua did not begin with commands. He began by placing Israel's story inside a longer history of allegiance, speaking the message of Israel's God. Joshua reached back beyond Abraham. Terah, father of Abraham and Nahor, had lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Abraham had been taken from that world and led through Canaan. Isaac was given to him, then Jacob and Esau. Esau received the hill country of Seir, while Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. The account moved through Moses and Aaron, the plagues upon Egypt, and the escape through the sea. It recalled the Egyptian pursuit and the waters that covered the chariots and horsemen. Israel then lived in the wilderness for a long time before entering the territories east of the Jordan. The recital included opposition from the Amorite kingdoms and from Balak, king of Moab, who called Balaam to curse Israel. The intended curse did not determine Israel's future. Sihon and Og fell, their lands were taken, and the tribes reached the Jordan. Then came Jericho and the peoples west of the river. Joshua's speech attributed their defeat to divine action rather than Israel's sword or bow. The nation had received a land for which it had not performed the first labor, cities it had not built, and vineyards and olive groves it had not planted. The review brought Joshua to the choice on which possession now depended. Israel must fear the Lord and serve him with integrity and faithfulness. The people were to put away the gods their ancestors had served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt. If serving the Lord seemed undesirable, they must choose that day whom they would serve, those ancestral gods or the gods of the Amorites whose land they now occupied. Joshua then made his own position explicit. He and his household would serve the Lord. He could distribute towns, command armies, and warn leaders, but he could not choose allegiance on behalf of every Israelite household. At Shechem, after all the land had been assigned, the nation had to answer for itself. The people rejected the idea of forsaking the Lord. He was the one who brought them and their ancestors out of Egypt, performed the great signs they had witnessed, preserved them through the journey, and drove out the peoples before them. They declared that they too would serve the Lord because he was their God. Joshua did not accept their answer as an easy conclusion. He told them they were not able to serve the Lord, who was holy and jealous. If they forsook him and served foreign gods, he would turn against them and consume them after doing them good. Their spoken confidence must not disguise the gravity of what they were undertaking. The people insisted they would serve the Lord. Joshua answered that they were witnesses against themselves because they had freely chosen this allegiance. They agreed that they were witnesses. He then told them to remove the foreign gods that were among them and incline their hearts toward the God of Israel. Their answer came a third time. They would serve the Lord their God and obey his voice. The repetition did not add new information. It established the public commitment under challenge. Joshua had placed the danger before them, refused a casual promise, and made the people hear themselves choose. That day, he made a covenant for Israel and established statutes and ordinances at Shechem. He wrote the words in the book of the law. The final public work of Joshua's leadership was therefore not another territorial grant or campaign order. It was a recorded covenant binding the settled nation to the God whose gifts now surrounded it. Joshua took a large stone and set it beneath the oak near the sanctuary. He told the people that the stone would stand as a witness because it had heard the words spoken before the Lord. If Israel later denied its commitment, the place itself would recall what the nation had said. The stone could not compel obedience, any more than the stones at Gilgal could force later children to remember the Jordan. It gave memory a location, at Shechem, where Abraham had once entered the land and where Israel had read the law between the mountains. Joshua left a physical witness to the choice that completed his work. He dismissed the people, each to an inheritance. The assembly did not march back to one wilderness camp. Judah returned south, Joseph to the central hills, the northern tribes toward Galilee and the coast, and the eastern tribes beyond the Jordan. The covenant spoken by one congregation now had to be lived across separated territories. Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. Israel buried him within his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. He had received that town only after every tribe had been assigned its portion, and it became the place where his body remained. Israel served the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime, and during the lives of the elders who outlived him, those who knew what had been done for Israel. The statement gives his generation a real period of faithfulness. The covenant at Shechem was not followed immediately by universal abandonment. Two other burials completed the settlement's closing scene. The bones of Joseph, carried up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the parcel Jacob had purchased from the sons of Hamor. What began as an ancestral burial request ended as a grave inside the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. Eleazar the priest also died and was buried at Gibeon, a town given to his son Phinehas in Ephraim. The book of Judges then turns to the unfinished possession left within the tribal lands. It places its survey after Joshua's death, while also repeating the older Caleb, Othniel, and Achsah material. The arrangement collects the results of tribal campaigns and failures, rather than supplying a strict diary in which every repeated event occurred after Joshua's funeral. Judah and Simeon fought together in the south. They defeated Canaanite and Perizzite forces at Bezek, campaigned around Jerusalem, and continued into the hill country Negev and foothills. The account repeats Caleb's grant at Hebron, the removal of the descendants of Anak, Othniel's capture of Debir, and Achsah's request for springs, placing those remembered successes beside a widening record of incompleteness. Benjamin did not drive the Jebusites from Jerusalem. Manasseh failed to possess Beth-shean, Taanach, Dor, Ibleam, and Megiddo, though it later subjected their inhabitants to forced labor. Ephraim left Canaanites in Giza. Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali also lived among populations they did not remove. The Amorites confined Dan to the hill country and resisted its descent into the valley. The pattern was no longer one united army confronting a royal coalition. Each tribe made local decisions about difficult cities, useful labor, and tolerated worship. The unfinished portions Joshua assigned became places where compromise could take permanent form. A messenger of the Lord came from Gilgal to Bochim and accused Israel of breaking the covenant by making accommodations with the inhabitants and leaving their altars standing. Because Israel had not obeyed, those peoples would remain as adversaries, and their gods would become snares. The people wept and offered sacrifices there, giving the place the name Bochim, weepers. After Joshua's generation was gathered to its ancestors, another generation arose that did not know the Lord or the work done for Israel. The gods Joshua had ordered them to put away drew their service. The covenant witness remained at Shechem, and the land remained divided among the tribes, but knowledge had not survived merely because stones, boundaries, and graves endured. Joshua lay at Timnath-Serah, inside the country he had entered as a scout, crossed as a leader, and received only after serving everyone else. Around his grave stretched the promised inheritance, real, settled, and still unfinished.